Everyone, welcome to the East Coast Conference. First, I want to thank Boston College, the History Department, and the Institute for the Liberal Arts here, along with the Graduate Student Association, for helping us do this and help fund it. First, the Platypus Affiliated Society. About us, we were established in December 2006. We organized reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, focused on problems and tasks inherited from the 1920s to 30s old left, 1960s, 70s new left, and 1980s to 90s post-political left, the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Platypus Student Club at Boston College runs a weekly reading group on Monday nights at 7 p.m. We meet in Stokes South 394. There's a sign-up sheet in the vestibule if you want to sign up for our activities or our weekly email group. We also run a weekly coffee break right outside here in the Chocolate Bar Cafe on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. And we also have a monthly Platypus review that you can find out there in the vestibule as well. So you can also find more about us online at platypus1917.org. And before we begin, I want to quickly announce the rest of the conference events this weekend. And you can find all this on the schedule online, also on the printout up front. So all events today will be in this room, and tomorrow we will be doing the Freedom Trail tour and then at Harvard University. So today we'll have this event, and then we'll have a 2-hour lunch break and then come back here at 3 p.m. for a live interview with Matei Alexandru Primeji to learn and ask about the organization he's a part of called the Congress of Workers Organizations, New Hampshire. Then after a short coffee break, we'll have a 5 o'clock panel, The American Revolution and the Left, featuring Daniel Lazaire, Benjamin Studebaker, Matei Alexandru Primeji, and Tom Pinnow. After that, we will go out for dinner and drinks for whoever wants to join us. And then, as I said, tomorrow we have the Freedom Trail tour. Unfortunately, Ethan Linehan, who is supposed to lead that, he lives in Florida and for obvious reasons can't come. So we still have James Vaughn, who will help essentially lead the tour. And then the rest of us will also supplement that. So we're meeting at 10 a.m. at the Boston Common, and the exact location is on the event page as well. And then finally, tomorrow at 4 p.m. at Harvard, we have the panel entitled Theory and Crisis, featuring Nikki Kierrigan, Benjamin Studebaker, Alex Kreiner, and Richard Rubin. And if you didn't catch all that, again, there's the forms up front. So now to introduce our first event here. This event, entitled 1776 and 2024 Revolutionary Boston and Capitalist Politics Today, it sort of morphed out of a series of teach-ins that we then decided would be best to combine into a single event up to 3 hours or however long we'd like to go, which hopefully will allow for a little bit more discussion. For our speakers, first we have James Vaughn, a longtime Platypus member and a professor of history at the University of Chicago. We have Spencer Leonard, a foundational member of Platypus since 2007, I believe, and a professor of history and sociology at James Madison University, and Erin Hagood, the president of Platypus and a history PhD at Columbia University. So without further ado, we'll start with James. Thank you.
I'm just going to go back to that. Can people hear me? Okay.
This is on.
Oh, this is on. So this is better to speak into? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. People can hear me? All right, great. So I have two broad purposes. One, I'm in a division of labor with Ethan Linehan to prepare the Freedom Trail tour tomorrow, which is really kind of one of the main attractions. And so the purpose of this talk is, in some sense, to prepare the ground for the Freedom Trail tour tomorrow morning. And the second purpose is also to do what Erin and Spencer will do as well, which is to speak to what is sometimes called the platypus approach to the American Revolution, but is really an attempt to recover, necessarily by way of reconstructing, the classical Marxist understanding of the American Revolution. So there'll be both elements of that in the talk, but I'm very much trying to relate that general trajectory of the American Revolution to specific doings here in Boston. Why? So because, as Thomas Paine famously said, the cause of America is the cause of mankind. And 2 years before that, as General George Washington said, the cause of Boston ever will be considered as the cause of America. So on the eve of the American Revolution, the cause of Boston was understood as the cause of America, which was understood as the cause of mankind. Why? Because playing out in and around the environs of this city was a deepening of the British imperial crisis, eventually transformed from an attempt to stay in and reform the British Empire into a revolutionary exit from it, not an exit from the ideals that they were attempting to achieve within the empire, but an exit from the empire to better fulfill and achieve those ideals on a new, more certain basis. So that's why Boston plays such a central role, not a specificity of Boston, but the way that the discontents in America and the imperial crisis congeal in Boston by the early mid-1770s, and the way the discontents in America with the imperial crisis are reflective of the discontents of a maturing, increasingly self-conscious, self-aware, or as they would call it, enlightened commercial society, bourgeois society of the 18th century. Okay, so I will go, I would like to start this with a quote from who I consider the greatest late 20th century historian of colonial and revolutionary America, Bernard Bailyn. He wrote in a bicentennial speech in 1976 the following on the American Revolution. If the colonists in the 1760s had been a youthful people, their mood had surely belied it. Nothing so clearly documents the transforming effect of the revolution itself as the elevation of spirit, the sense of enterprise and experimentation that suddenly emerged with independence, and that may be found in every sphere of life in the earliest years of the new republic. In other words, he's trying to push against the narrative that was established by the progressives of the early 20th century and the new left neo-progressives of the 1960s and 70s, that the later 70s and 80s had been a dark period and a counter-revolutionary or Thermidorian period. This expectant stretching and spirited, hopeful striving can be found in all the activities of men, in the brilliantly imaginative provisions made for opening up new lands in the West and for settling new governments with them, provisions that erased in one bold cleansing stroke the whole sordid, corrupt, and ineffective mess that the English government had made of the problem. In the surge of people westward, hopefully risking security for new and quite unknown possibilities. In the vast outbursts of commercial enterprise, spilling out into the once restricted markets of the West Indies and Spanish America, out to the continent of Europe, to Alaska, to Russia, and even to China. In experimental finance and path-breaking forms of banking, in bold, if not always successful diplomacy, and above all, in continuing experiments in government, ranging from the recasting of public institutions and of the forms for recruiting leaders to the separation of church and state, federal relations among states, and a new concept of citizenship. Far from the 1780s being a conservative or counter-revolutionary period that culminated in a Thermidor at Philadelphia, and far from that decade being dominated by self-searching despair for the future of Republican hopes, those years witnessed a vast release of American energies that swept forward into every corner of life. And Bailyn's argument for why the later 1770s and 1780s was in fact the fulfillment and not the betrayal of the American Revolution of the 1760s and 1770s is because, as he puts it, a single characteristic of this later revolutionary period predominates. Despite depressions, doubts, and fears for the future, and despite the universal easing of ideological fervor, The general mood remained high through all of these years. There was a freshness and boldness in the tone of the 80s, a continuing belief that the world was still open, that young, energetic, daring, hopeful, imaginative men had taken charge and were drawing their power directly from the soul of society they ruled. Directly from the soul of the society they ruled, and not from a distant, capricious, unmanageable sovereign. It was not simply that new forms of government were being devised. A new civilization, it was felt, a civilization whose origins could now be seen to have lain in the earliest years of settlement, was being created, free from the weight of the past, free from the corruption and inflexibility of the tangled old regime, whose toils had so encumbered Americans in the late colonial period. Now, I fully agree with what I just quoted you from Vaughn, which is why I quoted it. But nevertheless, I would like to offer a friendly amendment. He says the 1780s was the realization of the 1760s and 70s because they had broken from an alien transatlantic distant sovereign. And rather, as he said, their sovereignty was rooted in the soul of their own society. I would rather say they had placed sovereignty not in their own society, but in society itself. And there had, for the first time, really achieved the sovereignty of society, not the sovereignty of colonial society over itself, but the sovereignty of society over itself, a self-governing society where the state becomes fully an agency and instrumentality of society as a whole. So Vaughn, I think, is absolutely right to talk about the creation of the 1770s and 80s as the fulfillment of the 60s and 70s. But I think the fulfillment is not merely the achievement of breaking away from an alien distant sovereignty rooted in Britain, but rather breaking away from an alien distant sovereignty not rooted in society itself, right? But that sovereignty itself must be must emanate from society, that society must govern itself. And there were people all over the world, as Erin and Spencer will and can tell you about as well, better than I can, that were struggling precisely to realize the sovereignty of society, a self-governing society. And the only real success of the American Revolution is in an area of the world to have achieved that and to have built political institutions that lasted beyond the revolutionary ferment of the later 18th century into and through a fully developed capitalist modernity. That's the only speciality, or if you will, uniqueness of the American Revolution. The aspirations, the goals, the activities were pursued across the world of the 18th century, across the world of developing bourgeois social relations. They broke through and achieved some institutional political forms in colonial British North America in the 1770s and 1780s. So just to go into more specific details about that, basically, what is this society of which I'm speaking? Well, I simply mean society here in the double sense in which the Hegelian and Marxist tradition uses it, or rather, I should say civil society. Civil society is, in one sense, in the Hegelian Marxist tradition, all of social relations, the relations that are constituted between people. That forms the new form of society, the Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, the bourgeois society, the civil society emerging in the post-medieval Western world. On the other hand, a successfully fully constituted civil society that politically organizes itself creates another layer of civil society, which is what generally social scientists mean by it in our own day, those free, voluntary, associational relations of everyday life. So when I say civil society, I mean it in both senses. The totality of bourgeois social relations, all of the reciprocal relations greater than the sum of its parts between people, with themselves, with the world, the natural world around them, and with their consciousness, their innermost selves. And furthermore, how once that's politically organized and institutionalized through the universality of law, a law that truly emanates from society, is an accountable society. It consolidates a realm of everyday life, civil society, where free laborers voluntarily interact and exchange with one another. And that may have local expressions, right? There may be a civil society in colonial British North America in the United States, but it is simply, right, through a successful political and institutional organization, just the achievement of the consolidation of a global phenomenon of bourgeois social relations. So local developments very much depend on global social relationships developing. Essentially, by the time of the 18th century, the 1700s, bourgeois society, civil society in this sense, have become aware of itself. This is simply what we call the Enlightenment. Bourgeois society, civil society, society as such becoming aware of itself. Now, some scholars and writers such as Carl Polanyi, E.J. Hunter refer to this as the discovery of society. That in a sense, there had always been reciprocal relations amongst people that fundamentally constituted them, that there were always societies. And all the Enlightenment does is discover that there had always been societies. There are others like Keith Baker, a very prominent historian of the French Revolution, that insists on it's an invention of society, that there actually is something new going on in the world that the term society is given to. It's not simply the discovery of a pre-existing thing. I would counsel we need not choose between these things. When we have bourgeois society coming into being, the society of the social relations of free laborers, we have a level of sociality we have never had before, right? That is to say, we have a level of reciprocal social relations amongst people that both creates something greater than the sum of its parts, that is society, and that had never existed before, but also can retrospectively allow us to see that there have always been an organization of reciprocal relations amongst people, societies, but that they had never been as fully social as the bourgeois society of the 18th century. The bourgeois society of the 18th century is both the most social society, allowing that greater sociality allows for that greater reciprocality of relations amongst people, allows for more individuality than ever before. And that greater individuality in turn contributes to a much greater development of sociality. And here I am literally just giving a kind of very jargon-laden, very crude reading to Rousseau. I'm not saying anything in any way new or interesting or particularly Marxist. That is simply the achievement of the high enlightenment, the radical enlightenment. Nevertheless, there was an issue in the 18th century, which how do you politically, institutionally organize, consolidate the potentials and possibilities of society? How does society govern itself? How does it develop a political agency or instrumentality rooted in itself, responsible to itself? Okay, thank you. Hobbes, of course, was the one who really most clearly first posed this problem in Leviathan, a self-governing society. And his answer, most famously, was to erect a common power, an absolute sovereign, that was the expression of society as a whole, but became alienated from society and dominated it as an alien political force. But nevertheless, all the members of those society could realize, freely exercising their reason, that that absolute sovereign power dominating them was necessary for them to have the society or social relations that necessary to have what I would just simply term bourgeois society. I mean, Hobbes more or less defines it as such. Free laborers commodiously and comfortable living together, exchanging goods and services, and so on and so forth, pursuing their daily lives and private interests. It's the achievement of the English Revolution of the 17th century, by which I mean everything from the Civil Wars of the 1640s to the Glorious Revolution in 1688. It's the achievement of the English Revolution in practice and of John Locke in theory to subject Hobbes's alien sovereign power, this political instrumentality or agency by which society governs itself, to society itself. And the way that plays out concretely is it's understood that the constitutional monarchy and parliamentary settlement created by 1688 is society governing itself because Parliament makes the laws a deliberative assembly, And because the constitutional monarch cannot, i.e. the states, cannot rule without parliament, it therefore cannot rule beyond the law. It is unlike what Jean Baudin and Thomas Hobbes said, that you can't have law without someone who gives the law but doesn't receive the law. The point of 1688 and Locke is very much to say the giver of the law must also receive the law, that there can be nothing alien, there can be no alien absolute sovereign power outside and unaccountable to the society over which it rules, that there can be no political authority not accountable or responsible to the people over whom that public power is exercised in some broad sense. But nevertheless, it was the case that the British parliamentary regime was at best a partial implementation of this revolutionary project, of the becoming of the revolution of society turning into the revolution for society. For particular details I won't get into, but maybe will be talked about by Spencer or Erin, or will come up in the Q&A. Essentially, the British regime was understood by the mid-18th century to be at best a partial realization of this transformation, that it was an oligarchic, parliamentary, absolutist, in the language of the time, corrupt, partial realization of this transformation. And it lays into the thinkers of the mid-18th century, above all, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to re-articulate the tasks of a society that governs itself. That is the highest achievement of this principle of the general will, of the self-governing society. That people must realize that to be fully self-determining free individuals, they must inhabit a sociality. They must live in and amongst others, interact, exchange, have reciprocal relations with others, which means that they're going to be involved in heteronomy, receiving the law from outside themselves. But nevertheless, Rousseau is saying, how can they be involved in such a heteronomy while remaining autonomous, giving the law to themselves, right? That is, Rousseau is pointing out that people can only be genuinely free, self-determining individuals in society, in a free sociality where they benefit from that society's transformation of the world and its accumulation of the transformation of the world over time in history. And on the other hand, such a society can only benefit from free individuals who are self-determining, innovative, so on and so forth. So the goal of Rousseau in that concept of the general will is to reconcile heteronomy, the law from outside oneself, which one must have when men and women live together in the world and have reciprocal relations, with autonomy, that you nevertheless give this law from outside yourself to yourself, which he ultimately saw as having to be involved in small republics of everybody who lives in them gathering together at periodic times in assemblies, where they ceased being subjects of the law, but became the sovereign makers of the law, right? That there had to be small republics, and from time to time, everybody could gather together, put aside their subjecthood, their being subject to the law, and become sovereign creators of the law, which they would do. They would meet the criterion of the general will, of the necessity of living in a free society, but also being a free individual. They would be able to meet that criteria because they would never put in place any laws that they weren't willing to be equally subject to once the assembly dissolved, once society returned to itself. So it was key to him that all the subjects gathered together as sovereigns, determining this law that would then apply equally to all of them once they left, right? That could achieve this requirement. Now, I won't get into the details of this. Many people are extremely influenced by the social contract. It's being read all over the Western world by the 1760s, everywhere. Not just Thomas Jefferson, most famously, but there are many, many people throughout revolutionary North America concerned with this. John Adams himself reports finding Rousseau brilliant and frustrating, right? Basically being completely woken up by Rousseau at various points, and at other points scandalized that he just thinks that Rousseau is falling below the threshold of commercial society in certain kinds of ways. But anyway, to move on from there, what does any of this have to do with the American Revolution or the events in this town, Boston? And so this is the second half that I would like to talk about, which is that what is achieved in the American Revolution, in which Boston is a key theater, is precisely the first and really only lasting into modernity institutionalization of a self-governing society, of the sovereignty of society. And that is achieved above all else in the written Constitution. That's why American revolutionaries turned for the first time to writing constitutions. That's why later they write a new federal constitution and put it in place, because they are attempting to institutionalize the general will. They are attempting not to eliminate Rousseau's criteria for the general will, but rather to create a constant, ongoing expression of the general will that controls the political institutions they've created. That is the aim of the American revolutionaries in writing first state constitutions and then eventually in drafting and ratifying the United States Constitution in 1787, 1788, is precisely the idea that there is a fundamental law that the state does not create, but rather the fundamental law creates the state. And that fundamental law controls the state throughout all of its activities. Right? There may be something in the state called the legislature that makes laws, but those are merely ordinary, regular laws made by majorities that are elected or representatives that are elected and determined through whichever system. But that lawmaking or legislative power is controlled by a higher law, a fundamental law, which is the general will of society as a whole. So law pre-exists the state, and the state, even when it's making law, such as in a legislative body, or enforcing law in an executive body, or interpreting law in judicial body, is controlled by a higher law, a fundamental law, an extraordinary law that is in no way, shape, or form ever created by the state, but is rather produced by the totality of the people themselves as a social collectivity, the general will. And the turn to writing constitutions is the attempt to put that down as a controlling force on paper. And when people want to rewrite their fundamental law, they must come together in great conventions and assemblies with supermajorities and change it. Because they are not just merely changing ordinary law, which mostly requires majorities or 2/3 or what have you, but they're gathering together to change, as Rousseau talks about in the social contract, the fundamental law of society. And that's why they are erecting high obstacles to constitutional change. Not that they don't imagine constitutional change, right? They think that that's a possibility, but that must be the totality of society reflecting and deliberating on itself, debating and discussing in large conventions and assemblies, and overwhelmingly agree to changing things, if that makes sense. These ideas actually first clearly emerged in this town, in Boston. And I'll just, the third and final part of my talk is just to tell you the story of how these ideas first received articulation in Boston. Essentially, following the Glorious Revolution, the colonies in British North America had considered themselves part of an empire of liberty. They considered themselves provinces in a British empire of liberty, ultimately rooted in England and above all in London. And they understood themselves to be constituent parts of that empire. To cut to a chase, to make a long story very, very short, the new bourgeois social relations that were coming into being in the western half of Europe, Europe west of the Elbe River, more or less, were emerging in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And the whole migration of peoples, the whole settlement of marchlands and plantation settlements on the eastern seaboard of North America had just been an expression of those emerging bourgeois social relations. And originally the goal was to try and actually reconstitute metropolitan mother country social order. But in the conditions, the colonial conditions of life, the conditions of marchlands, of settler colonies, they failed to constitute those old metropolitan social orders. they don't successfully implant as they had intended a titled aristocracy, great persecuting religious establishments, churches, standing armies, old regime monarchies, all of that. So what happens unintentionally is those new bourgeois social relations basically constitute society itself from the beginning. There is far less of a compromise, far less of an agreement with the past in the colonies than there is in Europe, because of the failure for traditional social forms to carry themselves across the Atlantic and constitute themselves there. So the bourgeois social forms are basically constituting social and political order very much from the beginning. And the kind of crude way of thinking about this is all land is essentially commercial. All labor beyond the slave plantations is essentially free and not bound up in patterns of deference and tradition that have accumulated back in the old world. There are no vast religious establishments, standing armies, all the accoutrements of monarchy and sovereignty and all of that. So bourgeois society unintentionally becomes much more fully manifest there. From the beginning is much more involved with less of a compromise with the past. And as a result, colonial North America becomes the most rapidly developing, prior to the Industrial Revolution, colonial British North America is the most rapidly developing place in the world. Prior to the 19th century, the free laboring populations of colonial British North America developed more socially and economically in a quicker rate than it ever happened before in human history. They go from being under 200,000 people in 1700 to over 2 million at the time of the Revolution, which is not merely the most rapid demographic advance in the history of the world prior to the Industrial Revolution, but as Adam Smith tells us, it's not merely a matter of demography. And I'm sure Spencer will say much more about Adam Smith. He's, to my mind, the best interpreter we have of Adam Smith. And he will undoubtedly lay this out more clearly than I do. But, you know, if you can find it in Smith, if you don't believe me, in other words, the demographic advance, the baby boom, if you will, is not because there are simply more people, because those people are essentially relating, interacting with one another differently than ever before, right? As he puts it, the natural course of liberty, right, has realized fullest expression there. So their demographic growth is not what makes them economically and socially prosperous to a degree previously unseen. They have the highest rate of per capita income by the 1740s and 50s in human history. It's their social relations that then express themselves demographically. As Smith says, what's the best way to ensure? How do you know that your society is the freest and richest? The common people have a lot of children, and those children live into old age and have a lot of children. And that is the highest aspirations of bourgeois society. So all of this being said, there comes the imperial crisis in the 1760s and 1770s. And maybe that will come up more in the Q&A. Spencer and Erin may talk about it more in their talks. I will just simply try and concretize the way it plays out here in Boston, okay? Essentially, during and after the 7 Years' War, the British political elite, the British governing class, by which I essentially mean all the ministers and servants of bureaucrats in the constitutional monarchy, all the land elite gathering in parliament, everybody making and enforcing law, begins to essentially take the empire in a politically autocratic and economically extractive direction. They do this on the basis of the idea that the king in parliament, King George III, and parliament itself is absolutely sovereign, that it represents a sovereignty beyond society, outside of society, that society needs in order for society to be in the first place. It begins articulating that essential Hobbesian point that society must create something outside of itself, the state, that then turns around and controls society, because the only way you can have society is because the state holds social relations together. And Parliament begins articulating precisely that view, that Parliament is that unaccountable, alien, absolute sovereignty outside of society itself that is necessary to hold society together, to have any kind of society in the first place. That social relations cannot be rooted in themselves, that they cannot have a force of their own, but rather have to be held together by an unaccountable, uncontrollable state power, a kind of state divinity, a mortal god, as Hobbes called it, and as Parliament thinks of itself by the 1760s and 1770s. And one of the ways in which that takes a manifest expression is the parliamentary regime begins insisting on enforcing the laws of trade navigation. These are laws regulating essentially trade, shipping throughout the British Empire and in the colonies. And as part and parcel of regulating those, enforcing those laws, they pass new writs of assistance in the early 1760s. Writs of assistance are just general warrants. But you have to think a general warrant does not say what the crime is, what the charge is, and it does not say who's done it and where the inspectors need to look, right? The police come to you with a warrant, there's a charge, there's an specific accusation, specific people are named, there's a location or right they have to search. The writs of assistance, the general warrants don't say any of that. It says these magistrates are empowered merely when they have suspicion to go throughout the houses, the storefronts, the ships, all throughout Boston. I mean, this is across colonial America, but it's most important in the port cities. It's supremely important here in Boston. Essentially, the magistrates and the customs inspectors can go anywhere. Your house, which is your castle. They can go into any ship, they can go into any business, any time of day in search of illegal goods, contraband goods that violate the laws of trade navigation. If they find any, they can knock on your door, wake you up at night, search everything, leave, go to your business, do everything without any actual proof, any judge ever having been convinced that there's reason for cause, naming a place, naming a person, no specificity. And then if you do eventually get tried if they find contraband goods, but in these admiralty courts where you get tried, the judge is appointed by the crown, right, is responsible to that sovereignty rooted back in London, the king and parliament. And that judge is not trying you with a jury. The admiralty courts do not have a jury. They do not have civil society inside the courtroom. It is merely the state in the courtroom, the royally appointed judge. And the royally appointed judge keeps a portion of, if you're found guilty, the royally appointed judge keeps a portion of the rewards, the payments, the fines, and the contraband discovered. I only emphasize this because it's a clearer picture of the way the state completely removes itself beyond the bounds of society, becomes politically autocratic and economically extractive, right? Now, many people, Bernard Bailyn himself said that the American Revolution was driven by conspiracy theory, but you can see how such a state, even if it's initially just minor contraband, could very quickly, on these principles of political and economic action, become wholly removed to society and, in fact, not be the protector of society, but the destroyer of society. That this was a recipe not for the freedom of society, but the enslavement of society. And the first person that really makes this all clear is a guy whose grave we will see tomorrow, named James Otis Jr. And James Otis Jr. gives a speech about the writs of assistance in the Massachusetts Bay Superior Court, where many people are gathered there who become subsequently key founders and revolutionaries, most famously John Adams, who essentially say their entire mind became transformed in that speech. And subsequently, James Otis. James Otis is a Massachusetts Bay Colony lawyer, jurist. He's defending people who've been charged under the writs of assistance. And he refuses to make the case in the Massachusetts Superior Court about the specific criminal activity, the violation of the laws of trade navigation. He rather gives a gigantic oral disquisition on why all of this is wrong completely. And none of this court has standing, none of these charges have standing. The entire authority is illegal, but the real illegality is all of the authority putting these men on trial. And that therefore society must now try, the Massachusetts Superior Court must now try the customs inspector, must now try the magistrates, because they've become enslavers of society, criminals against society. And Otis goes on to give a number of newspaper essays and pamphlets. The most famous one is produced in 1764, partially in response to the Sugar Act, called The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. And it's there, for the purposes of where I'm going to conclude today, that Otis really lays out the case that the first law of all political communities is the fundamental law by which society governs itself. He lays out the case in his speeches and writings, concluding in this pamphlet, The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, that before people become political, they are social. They establish reciprocal relations in and amongst one another. They are social animals prior to being political animals. And they are able perfectly well, and here he begins in his work to expound on Locke, to have a sociality independent of the state, a formally constituted political relations. That they are able to have a division of labor, an exchange of goods and services, a culture, a science, families, kinship communities, groups, all of this, that sociality, using my own words, not his, exists prior to the state, prior to its institutionalization, and therefore that there is a fundamental law which controls the state, creates the state, that is prior to the state. That the state is not the creator of law, but the state is the law's first upholder in the interest of society as a whole, this fundamental law of society. And the picture he paints is that at the Glorious Revolution, what happened is the then King of England, the absolutist monarch, King James II, who's overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, was essentially the state running roughshod and rampant over society. Society gathered together and overthrew this monarch who had broken the fundamental social compact. And then there was a convention parliament held in London to basically draw up a fundamentally new social compact. Now, the way he puts it is not everybody from the British imperial world could come because of means of communication and transportation and all of that, but they were essentially an assembly of society as a whole, creating a new compact. And that's what they were doing at the Glorious Revolution in 1688. If any of you want to see the details of this, just read the beginning pages, early parts of The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, published in 1764 by James Otis. That's what they were doing. And he says you can never perfectly institutionalize the fundamental law of society. You can never perfectly do that. But what the English/British had done at the time of the Glorious Revolution is made the closest approximation. And the British Constitution was the closest approximation to the natural constitution of society. It had come closest. That's why the British were most free. And that is why he says that fundamentally, I'll skip the quote, it's still on. That is why fundamentally he says, irrespective, all British subjects, black and white, that is not me putting in there, he is putting in there, that in the colonies have civil rights irrespective of their rights in British law. Meaning there is a higher law of society that is beyond any of its concrete institutionalizations. Civil rights are not created by the state. Civil rights are created by our sociality. And what are the imminent needs of that sociality? That we want to be free, self-determining people, but we realize we cannot be generally free and self-determining without reciprocal relations with others, which means we must accept common rules, regulation, laws from outside ourselves, heteronomy, that we nevertheless would make ourselves, realizing that we need to live in and amongst others, autonomy. And that free society, that sociality, is the basis for even greater individuality. For, like Otis says, and in this sense, I'm not sure whether or not cribbing from Rousseau, but I believe possibly, right? That's why, really, in the state of nature, we're just slaves to appetite. I mean, that's the way Rousseau puts it, and Otis gives a different version of that. We're unable to do basic things, right? Okay, so all of that being said, Otis lays out there's this higher controlling law. And he basically says that the reason why the writs of assistance don't work, the reason why the laws of trade navigation don't work, the reason why none of this needs to be upheld, we can all just ignore it. And we don't have anarchy as there is this higher law. And to bring things to a conclusion, he becomes I apologize. He has a fight with the customs collector during the Townsend crisis, created by a later phase of parliamentary regulation in the late 1760s. There's a second phase of parliamentary regulation called the Townsend duties, which then all these questions come flaring back up. And there's again a general crisis, but it spreads all throughout the colonies, north and south completely. And he gets in a fight in the Boston coffee house with a customs inspector and is bludgeoned over the head and becomes a kind of mentally unstable figure having to be cared for by others. But John Adams famously says, John Adams was his greatest mentee. Otis was Adams' mentor. And John Adams famously says, let me, read you this quote. I apologize, I'm skipping over. He says, someone wants to write a biography of James Otis, and he's really delighted by this. So he says to this biographer, as long as North America shall have a soul, it will sell and immortalize your name, that is William Tudor, the biographer, as well as mine, that is John Adams. For James Otis was the real father and founder of the American Empire, more certainly than Romulus, that of the Roman. What he means by that is John Adams and Oxenbridge Thatcher and the Boston Patriot movement and all of the other patriots that they were interacting and corresponding with throughout the colonies had essentially come to conclude that there was a fundamental law of society that was higher than the British Constitution, that was higher than any institutionalization of the British Constitution, the constitutional monarchy, the parliamentary regime, and that law must ultimately control those institutions. And if those institutions violate it, they can take up arms not to destroy society, but to preserve it from the true anarchists, the true rebels, the true destroyers of the bonds of society, the constitutional monarchy, the parliamentary regime, the British Constitution acting arbitrarily itself, right? And that is the key move to the realization that you need a written constitution, that a modernizing commercial society where people are involved in their own affairs, ensconced in an extensive division of labor, where people elect representatives, have a representative liberal democratic system rather than a direct one, because they cannot spend all days making laws. And people should merely make laws that allow for a free society to pursue its own aims and interests. They should not make laws that determine how you should live your life. That such a society, such a social political order requires a fundamental law of society that controls society as a whole. And that means there needs to be a written constitution that is not an alien sovereignty, that can itself be changed by full assemblies and conventions of the entire people. But that is the idea of what they're arguing, that essentially that you need to find a way prior to simply saying that there's sociality before political life, that there's society before the state. You need to find a way that society, without all having to gather all the time, give up their private lives, abandon their families, give up their careers, their jobs, their pursuits, get together and debate laws all day. Rather, what should happen is that prior to forming the political order, you need a written constitution that would embody such an assembly of all the people, that would embody such a general will of society. And that in turn would be the higher fundamental law that controlled the state itself. So in other words, the Constitution is the revolutionary institutionalization of the general will meant to control the state and the everyday lawmaking itself. And it's in that case that many people come to say, like Samuel Adams, like John Adams, like Alexander Hamilton, like Thomas Paine himself, retrospectively realize how much Otis's arguments contain what they end up doing when they build the new regime in the 1750s 80s that they contained the attempt to write down, to constitute the general will of society in an objective form so it can control the state and even the legislature that makes the laws for the people living in and amongst one another in the world together. And I will just say this at the end to try, I mean, I'm not speaking to any contemporary politics, but something that worth keeping in mind, just to conclude with, is when people who present themselves as progressive and more enlightened, when they come and say, this Constitution is from an archaic dark age, when everybody were family farmers and it's meaningless, and it's constricting us and it's confining us. Okay, and they say, we've moved beyond it, we're more progressive. This is stuck in the past, we've advanced, society has changed. We want to be people of the future unrestricted. Of course, I'm not saying society hasn't changed since the Constitution. But people who want to essentially use that argument to suspend the operation of the Constitution want effectively to suspend themselves from the control and accountability of the fundamental law of society. That's what they want to do. These people are not our friends. It is the sense that a fully developed proletarian socialist movement will have to confront the constitutional order. But there can be no predetermining what that confrontation will be like other than through the mass attempt to transform the world. Anyone who comes ahead of you, a law professor, a bureaucrat, who says, well, essentially an administrative state with the expertise of law professors and bureaucrats can kind of operate free from the Constitution. But what they are doing is they are suspending the constitutional order, the fundamental law of society. It will be that a proletarian socialist movement will confront the constitutional order and attempt to change the constitutional order, but only to transform in a deliberative process the fundamental law of society. The progressive critique of the Constitution is not about transforming the constitutional order. It's about suspending it. So an administrative state full of law professors and bureaucrats who want to nudge you, as Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule put it. And there are people on the left and right? Adrian Vermeule, a right-wing law professor, Cass Sunstein, a left-wing law, who want to nudge you in the direction you should be living your lives. Because society has changed and you don't know how to live your life. And these people with superior expertise will gather in the administrative state and figure out ways to nudge you, not force you, but nudge you gently in living the way you should appropriately live. They want to suspend the fundamental law of society. They do not want to serve it. They do not want to actually create a new form of regime that is accountable to a transforming, changing society that will indeed someday supersede that order. They have no interest in superseding the constitutional order. They have no interest in the kind of social transformation necessary to supersede that constitutional order generally. Their interest is simply to suspend the operation of the fundamental law so they themselves can be an arbitrary power, an alien power, ultimately not rooted in immanent society, but ruling above society in what they understand to be its best interest. I realize I've gone 2 minutes over and I'm sorry.
We didn't entirely decide what our division of labor was going to be, but I think it's fairly fortuitous. I just want to put a punctuation mark on some of those comments that James just made. It seems like to me there are many occasions for this panel. One of them is the election itself. And I think that that's what those comments were about. The question of removing not just the freedom from constitutional constraints, but the freedom from the shame of flouting constitutional restraints. Right? The imperial state in the United States is a constitutional aberration, monstrosity, really. But what we see today on the part of the ruling class is the desire to remove the shame of that, right? And to declare the Constitution and the constitutional order somehow retrograde. And in the name of progress, and in fact cheered on by the left in many cases, to no longer have to answer to the systematic violation of bourgeois norms that the imperial state requires. But there are a lot of other occasions. It seems to me that this in this election itself, I think, to me, raises the question of the end of the long crisis that gave rise to Platypus itself as a project of the millennial left, or of the social historical crisis that politicized a generation, and that Platypus intersected that long crisis of neoliberalism. It seems to me signaled by the way that there's sort of no politics to the Harris campaign. There's just either a borrowing of Trump policies or a kind of deliberate podium character to those policies. It seems like the end of an entire crisis era, and it certainly raises for me the many times that I have spoken on Adam Smith as a critique of the millennial left. I've spoken on this subject at least 3 times for Platypus or in Platypus related venues, and written on it as well, and pushed for the inclusion of Adam Smith on our syllabus. But really a larger project that James is very much involved with as well, in terms of bringing what he calls the Hegelian Marxist vision to bear in our internal pedagogy, which required bringing the Hegelian vision to bear, and thus the entirety of the Enlightenment. Other occasions that I feel sort of authorize us. One, the upcoming 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, which I think our book on the American Revolution is going to be very timely for that. I also think we might be the only leftists in America that are willing to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And I think that that's telling, and we need to embrace that, right? I hope Platypus rolls out a whole series of events in 2026, including here in Boston. And when we have James come to speak on that occasion, I think rather than applause, we should drink whiskey and set off fireworks. I also wanted to note, although I guess the rumors of his death have been much exaggerated, the passing, I think, is almost certain this year of the most prominent leftist of the past half century, Noam Chomsky, who may be the last prominent American leftist who remembers that socialism comes from the Enlightenment. For all of his faults, he would be the one who would acknowledge the necessity of talking about Adam Smith and the American Revolution, my topic here. So even as he is the progenitor or the kind of nestor of so much rotten anti-imperialism on the American left, and anti-bourgeois anti-imperialism, illiberal anti-imperialism, anti-socialist anti-imperialism ultimately, At the same time, he knows that you have to authorize that with the name of Adam Smith. So you can see that in a book that I read when I was the age of some of you students in the room. Year 501 that he wrote on the 501st anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America in 1993. Which is it's an openly Adam Smithian account, and at the same time, a kind of miserable, illiberal, anti-imperialist screed. Now all we'll be left with is the miserable, illiberal, anti-imperialist screed without the memory of the Enlightenment and its authorization of American anarchism and thus of much of American socialism at all. Okay. Those are all throat clear exercises. This paper also, in a sense, follows from my comments in 2023 on America as the land of the future, as Hegel put it. And I want to think about that in relation to the revolution itself, and Adam Smith's account of universal history and where America fits and the American Revolution fits into world history as understood by Smith. And I think Smith is the most developed, in some ways more than Hegel, vision of world history coming in the aftermath of Rousseau. So there is a happy kind of complementarity between my comments and James's comments, because his focused on the 80s and the moment of Constitution. I want to focus on the crisis of the British Empire as a crisis of world history in the 1760s and 70s. And the turning point in the 18th century and the turning point of the Enlightenment. James anticipated this by talking about Rousseau. There's a kind of a happy accident or a very curious kind of coincidence between the drafting of the discourse on the origin of inequality in 54 and on the social contract in 62 and the 7 Years' War crisis that is the turning point of the 18th century, where the ongoing war between France that had in some ways been launched by the Glorious Revolution or given in certainly a new content by the Glorious Revolution resulted in the absolute across the board victory of the British Empire. Victory in Asia, victory in Africa, victory in Europe, victory in North America. So that this plucky, peripheral Western European power, self-understanding, it's the understanding itself largely as a Protestant power, has come to hold the fate of humanity in its hands and to become the first superpower of world history. And I think that it's that moment that Smith captures in his appropriation of Rousseau, saying, look, you're grasping this at a philosophical level, right? But you're not being true to your own thought in the sense that you're not specifying the nature of the historical crisis adequately. And that is the significance of The Wealth of Nations. It's a vast, in the spirit of Rousseau, critique of Rousseau regarding what is the crisis of the general will? What is the crisis of the revolution, ultimately? And the crisis of the revolution is arising from its success. This is why we get these Rousseauian preoccupations with glittering misery, as Kant puts it, right? Of a revolution in stagnation, of a revolution that is that comes to believe that freedom is something that it possesses, that it can put in its pocket, as Hegel says at one point. So central to Smith's specification of, I'm going to read a bit, central to Smith's specification of Rousseau's critique is the American crisis. Really the crisis of the British Revolution, which found its most acute expression in overseas colonial questions, North America and India. Already in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith identifies America as the most rapidly developing and most natural region within emerging world society. First of all, as Smith remarks, the pattern of settlement is relatively unperverted, and this is some of what James was talking about. Thus, in the chapter on the extent of the division of labor, Smith remarks, in our North American colonies, the plantations have constantly followed either the seacoast or the banks of the navigable rivers, and have scarce anywhere extended themselves to any considerable distance from either. Just as the earlier agricultural civilizations grew up around the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus and the Yellow Rivers, North American settlements clustered around the Massachusetts and Chesapeake Bays, and the Connecticut, Hudson, Delaware, Potomac, James, and Savannah Rivers. The peopling of these places, likewise, was relatively natural in Smith's terms. It was Greek in that it was largely driven by population increase and the immigrants' own desires. In these overarching circumstances, the settlement of Britain's North American colonies rendered them the most flourishing region in the world. Indeed, though Smith's categories are not descriptive but critical, that critique emerges from the existing potentials of bourgeois society, and those are best exemplified by America. It is not the actual greatness, quoted, it is not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continual increase, which occasions a rise in the wages of labor. England is certainly in the present times a much richer country than any part of North America. The wages of labor, however, are higher in North America than in any part of England. So, though North America is not so rich as England, it is much more thriving and advancing with much greater rapidity to the further acquisition of riches. The most decisive mark of the prosperity of any country is the increase in the number of its inhabitants. James has already alluded to this directly. In Great Britain and most other European countries, they are not supposed to double in less than 500 years. In the British colonies in North America, it has been found that they double in 20. Indeed, it is difficult at first to fathom from Smith's account what possible grievances Britain's American colonies could harbor. The contrast with Britain's new colonies in India certainly couldn't be starker. Though not anciently settled like the Indus River, Bengal, like North America, was settled relatively late. Though Bengal was somewhat earlier. Still, there are key bases of comparison. Like North America, it's blessed with great natural potential for waterborne economic intercourse. The deltaic region of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, Bengal was ripe for civilization. As Smith writes of the region, the improvements in agriculture and manufacture seem likewise to have been of very great antiquity in the province of Bengal in the East Indies. Though the great antiquity of this is not authenticated by any histories of whose authority we in this part of the world are well assured. In Bengal, the Ganges and several other great rivers form a great number of navigable canals in the same manner as the Nile does in Egypt. And unlike America, Bengal was a center of manufacturing. However, the strongest contrast with America was to do with the region's overarching political economic desperation. Bengal represented the very height of the barbarization of the British Revolution. Under East India Company government, Bengal had been transformed into a country where the funds destined for the maintenance of labor are sensibly decaying. Every year, the demand for servants and laborers are, in all the different classes of employments, less than it was the year before. Where the company acts as both government and private interest in society, there is a reduction of the wages of labor to the most miserable and scanty subsistence of the laborer, and many are not able to find employment even upon these hard terms. In consequence, want, famine, and mortality prevail, and the population declines. Tyranny or calamity conspire there to render a fertile country much depopulated, as Smith remarks. And in case the contrast wasn't clear, he drives it home. Bengal is the very antitype of America. The difference between the genius of the British Constitution, which protects and governs North America, and that of the mercantile company, which oppresses and domineers in the East Indies, cannot perhaps be better illustrated than by the different state of those countries. The Indians, not the Americans, have immediate grievances to petition to their British imperial overlords. And yet Smith is highly sympathetic to the American discontent. This is really the deepest structure of the wealth of nations as it culminates in books 3 and 4, which are the core of that book. With book 5 of the Wealth of Nations being a kind of coda, is this contrast between the East Indies and the East India Company's rule in India and the colonial rule in America, and the paradox, shall we say, of American discontent, even though America is the most flourishing place in the world. Right? And this is something I think is a valuable question for the left today. Right? Are the most miserable and oppressed places in the world the places from which we expect the acutest political response? Or should there be such a response amongst perhaps the most flourishing people of the world, who are most jealous of their liberties, who are in a position to be jealous of their liberties? Right? The book that Smith is largely commenting on in book 4, Adrian Null's Philosophical History of European Settlement in the East and West Indies, at one point remarks, if we did to the French people what is being done to the people of Bengal, no middle-class person, no professional could sleep through the night without fear of having his throat slit. Right? So why do people, as it were, patiently endure tyranny? Why do they not respond? Why is freedom not an instinct? Right? These are the Rousseauian preoccupations of Smith. And his argument is, and this is, I'll close on this, and the great misunderstanding of Smith that centers on this. What Smith's master term for glittering misery or the stagnation of the revolution is mercantilism. It's a historical and philosophical category that is everywhere misunderstood as a set of policies, right? Any economics textbook, go to Wikipedia, there are entire books written on the subject, history books are written on the subject, that it's a policy that tries to keep colonies as raw material producers and manufacturing should be done in the metropole, or some other trade policy is mercantilist. in Adam Smith, mercantilism is the term that he gives to the crisis of the British Revolution. And specifically, the crisis of the British Revolution as the emergence of commercial, is driven by, undergirded by the development of commercial society and its self-consciousness in political economy, in the doctrines of political economy, which are the doctrines of, or the self-awareness of the emergence of a society based on freedom and specifically the institution of free labor. So Smith never wrote his book on politics and jurisprudence that he wanted to. If he did, I believe he would have argued what James just argued about the self-betrayal of Parliament as an institution of the revolution. How Parliament had become an instrument of tyranny. And that would have been his, as it were, the analog of the account of mercantilism, right? Of what we see with Smith in The Wealth of Nations is the social account, right? How did the doctrines of the self-emancipation of society, the consciousness of the self-emancipation of society, become betrayed or inadequate to present tasks? Why must Smith himself intervene to clarify those? You can understand it as, just as the sovereignty of Parliament is being betrayed by its assertion in the American Revolution. Similarly, the freedom of property is being betrayed in its assertion in the 1760s and 70s. The rights of merchants and their chattel property, their flourishing being identified with the flourishing of society as a whole, is Smith's attack. It's why he has to clarify the labor theory of value. Right? He has to clarify what it means, what the basis of wealth really is. And mercantilism is, in this crisis over the lack of clarity about political economy, and in that sense, the actual preconditions of the British Revolution and the British liberty, are being given, as I said, colonial expression. It's completely different in the two theaters. And this is never remarked upon. I don't know why. It's extremely clear in The Wealth of Nations. In the one case, mercantilist policy has resulted in the undercapitalization of the Asian trade. The Asian trade is being restricted by monopoly, by the East India Company. If we get rid of the East India Company, there'll be a vast expansion, there'll be a flood of capital and of merchant activity into Asia, despite the fact that it's such a distant frame. Nevertheless, Asia is such a promising proto-bourgeois world, a world of manufacturing, a world of urban production. It's the natural partner of Europe. This is what Smith thinks. Whereas America is overcapitalized. America, the capital is being artificially shoved into this trade through drawbacks and bounties, et cetera, so that he thinks, why do we tremble if the Americans even threaten a boycott? Right after in the response to bills the Americans didn't like in 1765, the Stamp Act and others. And why do we tremble at this? Because we have too much capital tied up with the American trade. And this is his argument. Again, it's a diminishing, seemingly, of the significance of the American Revolution. Say, we shouldn't be worried about these American colonies so much. We ought to be trading much closer to home. That's a general theme, even though he thinks there's more trade to be done with Asia. The general theme of the Wealth of Nations is, or a general kind of prescription of Smith is, invest in your backyard, invest in the hinterland, trade with France, trade with the Netherlands, trade with the neighboring county, trade with your, as I said, with your town, with your country. he thinks that, these, the long distance trades across the Atlantic are expressions of an unnatural historical development. So why did we get there? Why did we get to this point of mercantilism? Why did we get to the point where we believed merchant interests were the interests of society as a whole, where merchants were dictating legislation to ignorant aristocrats in parliament who were instituting mercantilist policies? Because for Smith, the whole of human history is a history of slavery, of the self-enslavement of mankind since the dawn of private property. He's absolutely Rousseauian about this, right? He makes it very clear, especially as he says in the Wealth of Nations, in the aftermath of the Roman Empire. The aftermath of the Roman Empire is feudalism. It's people loving to domineer. It's people taking pleasure in the domination over other people, right? It's celebration of war and of martial virtues. And bourgeois society emerges not as the assertion of a natural force, but as a recoil from feudalism. So he says throughout books 3 and 4, the policy of Europe has favored the towns. The policy of Europe has favored the cities. The policy of Europe has favored the merchants, right? Not agriculture, not the country. Why? Because the country is the domain of the feudal lords. So that bourgeois society has emerged for Adam Smith as an unnatural response to an unnatural condition. And it's emerged as a network of cities reaching out to each other over their own hinterlands where feudalism and slavery prevail to one another. So London to Edinburgh, to Glasgow, to Calcutta, to Madras, to Boston, to Philadelphia, and Baltimore, right? These different cities in a kind of web or network, in a sea of enslavement and feudalism and serfdom. And the task now, when the fate of human liberty is in their hands in the 1760s and 70s, is for Britain to be the epicenter of the consolidation of bourgeois social relations. Right? To finally eliminate all vestiges of feudalism in the countryside and to link the cities to their own countryside much more tightly, to bourgeoisify their country, right? And in this, the area in the American settlement is in the vanguard. This is what I meant by saying America is Greek or natural. The relationship between the town and the country in America is most bourgeois in the world. The farmers are the most bourgeois-like agriculturalists, and the towns are the most connected naturally to the people of their hinterland. So the controversies taking place in Boston are being followed by the small farmers in the surrounding countryside. The remarkable thing about Boston that exemplifies this is the fact that it's a very small place. It's a small city. And it's of world historic significance. It's a town of roughly 25,000 people in 1776. But because of the nature of its relationship to its hinterland, as well, of course, as it's looking out historically towards the world across the Atlantic, it's this sort of revolutionary hub, right? And that you could understand, in a sense, the entirety of the Wealth of Nations as an attempt to explain this, right? How is it possible that the torch of liberty is being raised highest in this provincial place across the ocean that's no bigger or more significant than dozens of European cities, right? but nevertheless has these intense debates, this intense and robust public sphere. And ultimately, Smith's argument is we should appreciate the American sensitivities about the rumor of a premonition of the possibility of an infringement on their liberties. Even though they're flourishing, even though they've got all of their rights more or less, though I don't want to diminish what James was saying about writs of assistance and the threat to American liberties. But Smith's point is the combination of the call of our natural liberty, which is being expressed in the rebirth of natural liberty in America. These kind of, and this seemingly natural pattern of settlement along seaboards, up and down rivers, without tyrannical relations, without feudalism in the countryside, right? The pattern of urban and country interconnection, which he sees as a reassertion of the natural liberty of noble savagery, ultimately, of our natures, combined with the heightened awareness of the lessons of the self-education of mankind through its long night of 10,000 years of slavery. Right? It's Boston both as the new world and the link to the old that makes it the revolutionary center of 1776. And I'll leave the rest to Erin in the Q&A.
Is it all? Okay, my remarks will be, is this, it sounds, okay, great, you can't even tell it's on when you're standing here. My remarks will be shorter, they'll be a coda. I am here really to address 2024 in the title. And I'm speaking primarily because another member of Platypus, Said Siddiqui, and I are currently attempting to produce an edited volume of Platypus's engagements on the American Revolution. Spencer mentioned this in his talk. So the book is shaped around the American Revolution lecture series that Platypus held in 2020 during the COVID lockdowns and the BLM protests ahead of the 2020 US presidential election. And the motivation to publish this book is conditioned by the upcoming 2024 US presidential election. That is to say, we are talking about the American Revolution today. We can't really avoid this fact because of the upcoming US presidential election and all the sturm and drum associated with it. So I'd like to point out a few things about the context in which our discussion today is happening and Platypus's lectures and engagements on the American Revolution. In 2020, when the American Revolution lecture series happened, the left was engaged in an attempt to rewrite American history. The 1619 Project of 2019, itself the appendage of the Democratic Party's anti-Trump strategy as it shifted from Russia, Russia, Russia to racism, sought to displace 1776 as the foundation of America and instead mark the 400-year anniversary of the first slave ship in America. As in 2016, protesters targeted statues and historical figures to tear them down, and commentators railed against America's 400 years of white supremacy. In the in the round table that we held at the end of this lecture series, one of the respondents, Chris Cutrone, said, "We still live with the question of the American Revolution. What kind of democracy, democratic republic, and constitutional order is the United States? It doesn't take much of a crisis, but just a weakness of the major capitalist political parties to throw the whole system into question, not only on the avowed left, but across the political spectrum, across all varieties of political thinkers in the United States and around the world. In other words, over the past 4 years, from 2016 to 2020, and again with the 2020 election, people around the world are wondering about the United States' constitutional order and its political system. That is the occasion for the lecture series. Marxism would have to make sense within that broader world historic narrative of the American Revolution and the constitutional republic that it gave birth to. Again, it's not an accident that rage was directed towards the statues of American revolutionaries in this year, 2020. It's a deeply ambivalent rage. It's not a simple rejection, but it's anger at the failure of the revolution that we've been facing this past year. And so that was in 2020, describing our American Revolution lecture series. Since 2020, those on the left, mostly Stalinist or post-Stalinist, have rediscovered the American Revolution. Tony Montero's Free School in Philadelphia hosted discussions about the three American revolutions, 1776, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement, and demanded the left follow Trump in taking up a fourth American Revolution today. In a latter-day critique of the 1619 Project, Tony wrote, formulations as the counter-revolution of 1776 and settler colonialism provide aid and comfort to defeated liberalism. Neo-Stalinist MAGA communists have joined calls to make the revolution with the American people, and the ex-Trotskyist American SWP has come out in defense of American civil liberties against the Democratic Party's lawfare. This apparent reorientation towards America, taking the form of an orientation towards the proverbial Trump voter, will likely prove fickle, motivated as it is by discontent with the Democratic Party ahead of the 2024 election. But we can say now, as Chris Butron stated on our 2020 American Revolution panel at the first ever East Coast Conference, that we are talking about the American Revolution because of the American election, yet again. The American Revolution continues. In our democratic republic, we accomplish what other countries accomplish through coups in our election. I would like to point out a statement that James Vaughn made about the American Revolution at the roundtable to help explain this. He said there that the American Revolution is an idea. Rousseau in The Social Contract said that he who wishes to make a constitution must think himself capable of transforming human nature. To realize the idea of the American Revolution in a constitution is to transform human nature. The American Republic lives because the idea of the American Revolution lives. As Hannah Arendt wrote in On Revolution, this is no mere academic proposition, for the oblivion of that idea would literally spell the end of the American Republic. The American Revolution matters to socialism because it is the continued revolution of society under capitalism. It is the conditions under which any possible social revolution would be made. The new forms of freedom and domination, new forms of politics and social life that are emerging will be determined by the current struggle over the meaning of the American Revolution as we observe through the US presidential election. Both major parties in the United States appeal to the American Revolution. Biden and Harris promised to save democracy, and Kamala began her first speech with a throwback to FDR's core freedoms. Trump and his friends, Elon Musk and JD Vance, etc., make up Team America, protecting our freedom of speech against those who would try and rob us of it. Trump is, after all, the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln. Behind the American
You gotta
Revolution.
signal to people that you're joking.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. I guess people, he says that it's funny. He says, I'm the greatest president since American Revolution. It's a joke.
If they don't laugh at Trump, they're not gonna laugh at you.
Yeah, I know. It's a joke. Okay, so behind this imagery of the American Revolution lies a deep ambivalence, the threat of, or the image of mob violence. Perhaps our revolution is not the revolution of society, but a revolution against society, an uprising of the rabble that will destroy all of our good social institutions and put us all in danger. This is at issue in the 2024 election. The 2024 election is a referendum upon the Democratic Party's prosecution of the 2020 election, namely their claim that through his support of the January 6th protests, Donald Trump has threatened the republic. These are the terms upon which the current election and the lawfare against Donald Trump as one of its major candidates are unfolding. The January 6th protest is imagined to be a group of mob rioters, like in the ancient Republic of Rome, who the barbarians at the gate who have come to destroy our Constitution. This raises the ambivalent image of the French Revolution in modern history. Was the French Revolution a social revolution, or was it rather an uprising of people who didn't have enough bread and wine and killed others as a result of it? To help us think about this, I want to read another quote from Hannah Arendt, this one a bit longer, also from On Revolution. She states, "These overthrows and upheavals, prompted by interest, though they could not but be violent and full of bloodshed," and she's talking about all of the revolutions of the past, until a new order was established, depended on a distinction between poor and rich, which itself was deemed to be as natural and unavoidable in the body politic as life is in the human body. Okay, so she's talking about the revolutions of the ancient world, in which it was, the people usually who didn't have work and they didn't have land, and so they rush into the city where there's not enough food to feed them, rise up and demand the heads of their leaders. The social question began to play a revolutionary role only when, in the modern age and not before, men began to doubt that poverty is inherent in the human condition, to doubt that the distinction between the few who, through circumstances or strength or fraud, had succeeded in liberating themselves from the shackles of poverty, and the laboring, poverty-stricken multitude was inevitable and eternal. This doubt, or rather the conviction, that life on earth might be blessed with abundance instead of being cursed by scarcity, was pre-revolutionary and American in origin. It grew directly out of the American colonial experience. Symbolically speaking, one may say that the stage was set for revolution in the modern sense of a complete change of society, when John Adams, more than a decade before the actual outbreak of the American Revolution, could state, quote, "I always consider the settlement of America as the opening of a grand scheme and design in Providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth." Theoretically speaking, the stage was set when first Locke, probably under the influence of the prosperous conditions of the colonies of the New World, and then Adam Smith, held that labor and toil, far from being the appendage of poverty, the activity to which poverty condemned those who were without poverty, were, on the contrary, the source of all wealth. Under these conditions, the rebellion of the poor, of the slavish part of mankind, could indeed aim at more than liberation of themselves and enslavement of the other part of mankind. Today, the demand to constitute the social revolution recurs, if in a highly mystified form. In a recent podcast interview that Donald Trump did with New York comedian Andrew Schultz, he said that we live in a divided country. It's divided and people don't work with each other. But if we can bring back wealth, then people will start cooperating with each other and we won't be divided anymore. If this sounds familiar, it might be because it's a funny and perhaps unintentional restatement of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, who argued that through free labor, self-love, our interest in ourselves, can become a form of cooperation and push us into social relation with our fellow human being. This is the demand to, as Horkheimer put it in The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, constitute the subject. The crisis of capitalism is not the crisis of the misrecognition of the subject, but the absence of the subject. The subject, everything depends upon the constitution of the subject, or the self-regulating socialist society. The dictatorship of the proletariat, that horrible, perhaps French Revolutionary Jacobin, ancient revolution, mob violence image, or at least so it is derided, will take place not in opposition to the constitution of society, but in and through the demand to constitute society. The dictatorship of the proletariat, as understood by Marx in his imminent dialectical critique of the demands of socialism and communism, is not a form of the destruction of bourgeois society, but rather a liberal form of social dissent from the current state of politics. It's a way of saying to one's elected officials and self-government, no, we aren't going to constitute society on this basis and to try and constitute it on a new one. This is why Lenin said that the only thing that the proletariat had was organization, the organization of a new form of society in and through bourgeois freedom. Trump is now passing into history, but he was already history. If we recall, he and Sanders, who came onto the political scene together in 2015 and 2016, were vintage 1980s reruns of debates that happened around Ronald Reagan's discontent with the welfare state and progressivism of 20th century American capitalism. In a way, the experience of the Trump era has been, like the millennial left as a whole, a late recognition of the unfulfilled potentials of neoliberalism constituted by the new left criticism of the Fordist Keynesian welfare state. They have come to fruition in and through a political crisis. What potential? The potential to constitute the subject, the possibility for the revolution of the social interest, the possibility of socialism. The history of America is the history of the reconstitution of the American Revolution, the history of the possibility for socialism, the history of the failure to achieve socialism, to achieve the social revolution, or to achieve the American Revolution. The task of the left is to clarify the history of the American Revolution. Its failure to do so is the destruction of real possibility. It's not only the destruction of the necessity and possibility of socialism, but as Arendt stated, the destruction of the American Republic. Everything depends today upon the clarification of the concept of freedom. So for Platypus, the American Revolution is the mirror image of the necessity of socialism. It is a consciousness of the past, which may, we hope, work to clarify and work through the blocks to thinking today, the taboos on the necessity of the revolution. So I hope that gave maybe some context to Platypus's engagements with the American Revolution over the past 4 years, now that they are in a way falling into history.
Right, so we have a little over an hour for a Q&A, but first I want to acknowledge something. I think that Daniel Lazaire walked into the room. Is this Daniel Lazaire?
No.
Okay, never mind. I thought Daniel Lazaire walked in right after James Vaughn's talk, so I wanted to make sure we didn't miss a potential tragic mistiming. Never mind, so let's open up to the Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just say that Donald Trump, of course, quotes Adam Smith and kind of gets up. So that would be apt that you're bringing up on a podcast. So I have two questions, and I was thinking about the history of Platypus's engagement with the American Revolution. So as Erin alluded to, kind of in the 2010s, really the 1619 project is the consummation of a whole bunch of things, because there had already been earlier texts written, and there had been a kind of long running idea that had been simmering amongst the new left. It's even engaged and confused. There's the scene where the teacher says, don't celebrate the slaveholder, bicentennial kind of thing. But I bring that up because, as then Erin said, since the 2020 panels, we have had this kind of, and they would call themselves Stalinists, it's not in a pejorative sense, a kind of Marxist-Leninist, like some kind of recapitulation of the American Revolution, or affirmation maybe. And it seems to be affirmed that, and I think this came up in Spencer's talk and James's talk, but I would like you to kind of really talk about it more directly, that now the American Revolution will get celebrated as an anti-colonial revolution, right? And you know who you can quote on that? You can quote Lenin from 1918. So there's like some kind of history of Marxism. And I'll just say one other person who participated in the 2020 lecture series, Reed, who Carlos is not here, he kind of took up that kind of, recapitulation through Browder, and I guess also Herbert Applesecker, and, to quote Max Shachtman, the 1938 CP convention was like ultra patriotic or something. It's like, American flags everywhere. So I was wondering if you could take up that in terms of the history of Marxism, of how even the affirmation itself kind of bears something about maybe the difficulty with dealing with the American Revolution. And then number two, I'll come at this from, I guess, the right, quote, so to speak. So Jonathan Turley just wrote this book about free speech, and he really emphasizes America in particular, and what he considers like an American innovation in free speech as opposed to what he considered the British functionalist way of defending free speech, that free speech is good because it allows for innovation or something like that. Maybe this is more for James, if you could talk about, I mean, maybe he's wrong and you go, no, that's his opinion or something. But if maybe you could talk about free speech and the American Revolution in particular, and if there was something new there. So I think you look into it. So yeah.
About the American Revolution as an anti-colonial revolution. I was, I guess, trying, maybe not being explicit enough. There's no such thing as it's like an anti-capitalist or anti-bourgeois, or really anti-colonial revolution, except in very formal senses. Smith certainly understands the peopling of America and the conquest of India as well, the conquest of parts of India, in a very Hegelian way. He recognizes that there are deep underlying historical forces behind this, and the question is, what is the potentials there? Right? It's not to be reversed. We have this awful 20th century notion that anti-imperialist revolutions are about breaking with or even delinking from, and you hear this language of delinkage on the left all the time. But the truth of the matter is that to the extent that there's ever any delinkage on the part of revolutions in the 20th century from the global capitalist order, it's because of boycotts that are being imposed and turning those boycotts into virtues, right? In this sense, the Cuban Revolution is very revealing, right? The boycott comes from America. It doesn't come from Cuba, right? Delinking, right? It's a crisis for them, right? Similarly, the opening of the Chinese markets is very revealing. They flourish on the basis of their linkage to the rest of the world, and in some sense achieve communism on that basis, right? Not on the basis of delinkage. This is all a fantasy of the rotten, illiberal 20th century left, right? The point, and so with respect to the American independence movement, American independence is a consolation prize. Adam Smith's goal, his book is written in the service of a revolution of the entire British Empire. That's the vision of that book. It's a book of the transformation of the entire empire from India to the New World. And he sketches out what that might look like, in fact. Talks about the representatives to an imperial parliament, representative forms of government emerging in India, how the demands for representation in America might be met in and through a deeper integration of the empire, predicts the transference of the capital of the British Empire to the New World within a century if this takes place, right? That's the project of the Wealth of Nations. What's remarkable is that given independence, which is in some ways a defeat, it's a defeat for the British, sure. And it leads to the British Empire becoming a counter-revolutionary force in response to the French Revolution, right? What Karl Marx calls Britain's debt to the 18th century revolution begins in 1776. The debt that it has to repay by leading the world to socialism in the 19th century, which is his project. even though the bloating of the American trade by all these bounties and drawbacks that I talked about, all these mercantilist policies, what James was talking about in terms of the flourishing and the kind of efflorescence of American society in the wake of the revolution actually results in a boosting of trade to North America even after the decline, after the elimination of those mercantilist policies. Right, so this has confused a lot of people. Right, because there's a deep transformation in the political economic basis of North American settlements with Europe as a result of American independence. But what it looks like in terms of trade volumes is a steady increase, more or less briefly interrupted by war. So the prediction that Smith is, you know, in a sense, Smith's deeper insight is that when we get rid of these artificial capital policies of encouraging investment in the Atlantic trade, we'll actually see a deepening of the overall trade volumes. All right, and a deepening of the interdependence across the Atlantic. That's realized probably faster than he himself would have predicted. But the goal for Smith is that it is the promise of the 7 Years' War. The goal is that maybe the British Empire will become the organizer of global bourgeois society. Self-consciously. It's at the center now of the European state system. Right? It's dictating to France, which is the most powerful state in Europe. It is the key ally of Frederick the Great. And its navy controls access to world markets. If it meets that revolutionary transformation, then there'll be a self-conscious world government, perhaps a system of states, but led by a central multinational state. A state that represents India, that represents Native Americans, that represents English settlers, that represents freed blacks, freed African slaves, that represents Scottish people, Welsh people, Irish people, British people, and represents all of them in relation to world society in its diplomatic relations. And that's his goal, but that project, even in its defeat, can't be postponed. Can't be ignored, which is why Hunt is going to come along right after the signing of the Treaty of Paris and say that the clarification of our diplomatic relations is the fundamental task of world history, right? A world state or system of states. In capitalism, of course, that project of global integration is taking place through its own self-contradictions. This is something that, you know, Marx comes to see, that rather than peace, diplomacy, and trade integrating the world, it's war. Right? That in and through war, the state system is actually deepening, intensifying. War between states is strengthening the world state as an imperial state, as a Bonaparte state, right? So that transformation under conditions of capital is something that, you know, people now identify as just like an American power project or something, right? They treat really a kind of naive America picking up the pieces of the collapse of the socialist revolution in the 20th century and just, you know, stabilizing it on whatever basis it could be stabilized on, which involves a kind of endemic war, but certainly nothing that's specifically American about that global chaos. They think of that as the only meaning of the American Revolution. Right, when really the question, that I always ask these leftists is, which of the socialist revolutions exactly did America defeat? Like, which of these projects of self-emancipation of society really did the left not defeat itself, but instead some, exterior power, American imperialism. Where is it responsible? Right? So that kind of problem, sorry, I'm condensing too much, but that role that the British Empire and Pax Britannica ultimately played in a kind of contradictory way by the late 19th century, in a way that we didn't sustain, is now being portrayed. Was assumed by the American world state in the 20th century. And just as the decline of Pax Britannica was not to be celebrated, but rather took place through World War, right? The decline of Pax Americana is not a product of anything good. In fact, it's a product of something worse, which is just rampant regression and disintegration, without the promise that high imperialism had of being the last stage of capitalism. Right, the end of Pax Britannica was supposed to be world socialism. Right, that would have redeemed its relationship to Africa, to India, as well as to its role in world history generally.
Just a quick comment on that, because I think James's, to your point, Spencer, I think James's comment earlier about the relationship of the state to society is actually really important for this. Namely, that a society has a natural state, or it constitutes a natural state. Now, when Marx says that there's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, what he means is that the transformation of society through global capitalism has given rise actually to the necessity of a transformation politically, right? The crisis of society is also a crisis of the political form. This looks like the Bonapartist state, which is also imperialism. So imperialism is the flip side of the Bonapartist state, right? So namely, there is a sort of necessity in capitalism to imperialism. The Trump interview that I quoted earlier actually is another funny moment where he's talking about, I'm pretty sure he's talking about the civil war in Sudan and about how he heard they were going to start fighting again. So he calls them up and says, like, if you don't make peace, that you get no business from us. And then he hangs up the phone, and then they just go and they make some sort of, agreement, and they decide not to fight each other. That's made possible by global capitalism, right? And it's in fact made necessary. And if it, the Democrats actually, a global bureaucracy, these sorts of people deal with it too. So we've come up with lots of ways of trying to deal with this sort of problem. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is really the demand to constitute this new political and social form on a more conscious basis, to be conscious of how we're transforming society in and through our relationship to its politics. And that's why, when Lenin says imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism and the imperialist war is the precondition for revolution, that's because the imperialist war is the crisis of the Bonapartist state on an international scale, which is the necessity of constituting it on a higher basis, a more conscious basis, as the dictatorship of the proletariat internationally. So anti-colonial revolution just completely misses the boat on all of this, and has basically an outmoded form of consciousness of what it would mean to have a revolution. It's looking to and also falsifying earlier forms of political revolution as a way of trying to kind of ensure the value of its labor. And what does that mean? It means, of course, the continuation of capitalism, because the only way that you're going to overcome capitalism is in and through, right, the crisis of imperialism and Bonapartism, which actually is something that Ben, who's in the audience, kind of pointed to in our interview that we just published with him, when he said, of course, capitalism only transforms through war. That's the only thing that has been transforming capitalism in a fundamental way in the last 200 years. Anyway.
Great. I want to just underscore what Spencer just said, which is there's an expectation with the total defeat of Bourbon France at the end of the 7 Years' War that the British Empire will become the global guarantor of bourgeois social relations, of a kind of global bourgeois society, because that's crucial. there is nothing you can really understand about the American Revolution without understanding the expectation that that would be the case and the deep disappointment that it's not. It's the need to hit the exit button. It's the need for independence, but not independence to constitute a nation state, to constitute a specific national people self-determining themselves, but rather independence to precisely constitute a better union of all peoples of the earth in some distant day. But that is what they're trying to do, not to create a local nation state, but rather to preserve that project that they saw come on the horizon during and immediately after the 7 Years' War of having a British Empire of Liberty that was a global guarantor. And that's why the late 19th century writer Lord Acton says that he's got a great line where he says the American Revolution basically comes down to the project of extraterritorial cosmopolitan radical Whigs. And what he means by that is he basically says they divorce the concept of society from anything to do with lifeways or traditional mores or blood and soil of specific people. And they suggest the state has to be accountable to society. But there's no real limits to society. So there's no real limits of the state. So again, the American Revolution is a project of extraterritorial, cosmopolitan, radical Whigs. That's his view. And by just read some things very quickly, some quotes, just to underscore this point. The whole origins of the American Revolution is not a movement for independence, but a movement of a greater union of the British Empire. Meaning the whole point of what we retrospectively call events, movements, aspirations that were for American independence had nothing to do with desiring independence. They had everything to do with desiring a more adequate union of the British Empire. This is something John Adams, once of this parish, writes. He again, it's later in life, it's in 1823, but somebody has written to him who's writing about his cousin Samuel Adams, and basically says, oh, I found in Samuel Adams' papers, there's this crazy idea of this greater British, like pan-Atlantic union that would take place. Is this his idea? And John Adams responds to this young man and says, I know nothing of what he has said of Samuel Adams, of the first motion at Salem for the Congress. But to ascribe to Samuel Adams or any other individual the project of a Congress is the most ignorant, absurd, and silly nonsense. And here's the rub. A Congress for the Union of the Colonies had been the wish and hope and expectation of every man of sense and every Whig from the year 1753 to the year 73. It was familiar to every woman and child. It was the hope of the Whigs and the dread of the Tories that the plan, and he goes a lot more details now, and he says, and all the other eminent Whigs of the time, I have no doubt, and have no doubt, all the Tories have previously concerted their measures to defeat it. Meaning, Adams is saying what Whigs wanted was a more unified empire of liberty. That's what they wanted. They did not want independence. They wanted greater union. And just one more quote to bring across this point. The first real attempt to achieve what becomes the federal system of the United States is not born in an independent America, but rather is born in the mid-18th century British Empire. There's something that takes place between leaders of the Iroquois Confederacy, leaders of American colonial government, and British imperial officials in upstate New York at the Albany Congress in 1754, where they basically begin debating and discussing, and more or less initially plan something like the first federal union, not to be the form of an independent United States, but to be a form of the British Empire. And this is just something from Franklin's letters coming out of this project. He says, this is Benjamin Franklin, who was the leading Pennsylvania delegate to the Albany Union Congress meeting in the summer of 1754. I should hope too that by such a union, basically they don't call it a federal union, but that's what they're driving at. The people of Great Britain and the people of the colonies would learn to consider themselves not as belonging to different communities with different interests, but to one community with one interest, which I imagine would contribute to strengthen the whole and greatly lessen the danger of future separations. It is, I suppose, agreed to be the general interest of any state that its people be numerous and rich, men enough to fight in its defense and enough to pay sufficient taxes to defray the charge. For these circumstances tend to the security of the state and its protection from foreign power. But it seems not of so much importance whether the fighting be done by John or Thomas, or the tax paid by William or Charles. The iron manufacturer employs and enriches British subjects. But is it of any importance to the state whether the manufacturers live at Birmingham or Sheffield or both, since they are still within its bounds and their wealth and persons at its commands? Could the Goodwin sands be laid dry by banks and land equal to a large country, thereby gained to England and presently filled with English inhabitants, would it be right to deprive such inhabitants of the common privileges enjoyed by other Englishmen, the right of vending their produce in the same ports or making their own shoes, because a merchant or a shoemaker living on the old land might fancy it more for his advantage to trade or make shoes for them? Would this be right even if the land were gained at the expense of the state? And would it not seem less right if the charge and labor of gaining the additional territory to Britain had been borne by the settlers themselves? And would not the hardship appear yet greater if the people of the new country should be allowed no representatives in the parliament enacting such impositions? Now I look on the colonies as so many counties gained in Great Britain, and more advantageous to it than if they had been gained out of the sea around its coasts and joined to its land. For being in different climates, they afford greater variety of produce and materials for more manufacturers, and being separated by the ocean, they increase much more its shipping and seamen. And since they are all included in the British Empire, which has only extended itself by their means, and the strength and wealth of the parts is the strength and wealth of the whole, what imports it to the general state whether a merchant, a smith, or a hatter grow rich in old or New England? So on and so forth. The point is, there is already a desire that the British Empire will be liberalized, democratized, reformed to be made a more adequate guarantor of bourgeois social relations. And the whole desire for independence is simply because that desire for a greater union that's a more adequate guarantor is considered impossible, that it's not going to happen anymore, right? The search for independence is a last resort. There is no anti-colonial sentiment being developed there at all. No anti-colonial sentiment whatsoever. And it's only in the process of realizing that the British Constitution is not what they thought it was, that they then insist on divorcing the historic traditional rights of Englishmen from what they consider the rights of all people, right? That's where they take the journey from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of man, because that is what they understood the British Empire to embody. And when they were essentially told, no, they're historic customary rights of Englishmen, it has to do with being in England. These cannot be deterritorialized. They make the move away from the historic customary traditional rights of Englishmen to the rights of man, and attempt to enshrine that in documents. And to go all the way back to your point, Danny, that's why the real right has always not liked the American Revolution whatsoever. I mean, the right that says that a community, a civil rights, your abilities and capacities must be rooted in the organic life ways, habits, mores of a people. That which runs from Edmund Burke through all the way to Patrick Deneen today, who I quite admire. He's a right-wing post-liberal, wrote this book, Why Liberalism Failed. He gets the problem with the United States is the American Revolution. He says so explicitly. He has the old school paleo-conservative claim that the problem with the American Revolution, it introduces all these crazy ideas about the rights of all people, right? Or as Lincoln put it, right, that Jefferson didn't just make it, I'm going to screw up how he says it, simply a national war for independence, but a claim of the rights of all people for all time, right? That's the all honor to Jefferson quotes. And that's what Deneen deeply dislikes about it. He recognizes something really alien and weird comes in, non-national comes in. And it becomes, and that's what he sees essentially as the failure of liberalism, that it's impossible to demore rights from the specific habits and life ways of people. That's why paleoconservatives and post-liberals want to say, that's why they were at the 1690 project before the 1690 project was. They said, no, you should forget 1776. What matters is specific cultures, habits, languages, ethnicities that exist in the colonies in the 17th and 18th century, and their life ways. And all other people should integrate into those life ways who immigrate here, etc. They really have to disown the American Revolution in that sense. Very quickly on the Jonathan Turley thing, all I would say very quickly, it is basically this. Turley, I don't know specifically what you're talking about with Jonathan Turley in that instance, but the point would be that Ed Remus is really very good on this question, which is civil right. I mean, he knows the contemporary literature very well on civil rights and what people think they are. But I will say this very crudely. I don't know it as well as Ed. But what strikes me when I talk to colleagues about civil rights is the incredible degradation and regression in the understanding of what civil rights are. Civil rights are people's freedoms and guarantees against the state. They're the rights of society against the state. And what they've become is the state's ability to control and maintain society. Meaning civil rights are articulated. Civil rights are the rights of minorities in the sense that they're the rights of all people, irrespective of 99.9999% of society being against them. So yes, in that sense, they're the right of the minority, even to the minority of one. They are the rights of minorities, but they're not, but the way they've become understood to most people is there are minorities oppressed by the majority of society. And therefore the state comes in to basically create these things called civil rights that protect minorities. And what winds up happening is the whole civil rights regime, the whole bureaucracy and NGO complex that's developed around civil rights in the post-war era has really come to meaning authorizing the state's control and management of society in the name of people that supposedly would otherwise be you'd ride roughshod over by the majorities, right? That's the point. Of course, civil rights are the rights of minorities, but in the sense that all of us are always minority in some aspect of our lives against others, against everyone. And civil rights has been perverted essentially to become an authorization for constant state control and interference under the name of finding more and more discriminated groups that the state has to more and more intervene to protect and create this entire panoply to essentially control and regulate. And it really doesn't have anything to do anymore with the rights of minority, but rather the ability of the state under the name of protecting the people against discrimination, becoming to have much greater control and regulation of everyday life.
This question is, I guess, in response to what James was saying about, the kind of anti-constitutionalism of contemporary left progressives. And I guess, it's something an idea that's pretty familiar with us, and the genealogy of it that you usually hear, goes back to primarily the New Deal and sort of liquidation of the CPUSA, into FDR's coalition. And I mean, I guess there's a way in which that's the most easily recognizable form of this phenomenon, because it's the I don't know, it's very degenerate form where FDR, the New Deal is sort of able to happen as this, in a way, kind of nakedly anti-constitutional project, to save society through ruling society from above it, because of the absence of the left, because there's not a group that can say, in response to that, no, actually, the revolution matters, the Constitution matters. So I guess that made me curious about, I don't know, the consciousness of there being a crisis of the Constitution in the original progressive era of the early 20th century and prior to World War I. I mean, I'm aware of things like the Progressive Party, the Populist Party, of course, the SPA. But I was curious, I guess, more about the sense in which, I don't know if at all, there was a way in which in mainstream American politics it was registered that there was and ongoing crisis of the Constitution in this period.
In what period now?
Oh, sorry, like, I mean, I guess I'm thinking sort of the high era of the Second International, so like, 1890s up till World War I.
I just wanted to add something about the contemporary crisis, like what James was saying, and the issue of civil rights. I mean, the degradation around our understanding of that. I mean, the craziest notion is that now the right to live, to earn your own way in society, to make your own livelihood, is a privilege granted by the state. Right. This is the suspension of people's ability to work during the pandemic was a staggering and sweeping assault on a civil rights so elementary that the 18th century founders couldn't imagine enumerating. Right, your right to live by your own labor and not at the sufferance of the state is so basic to the independence, to the social understanding of the potential independence of labor. Right, and in that sense of such a basic concern to socialists, right, who of course do not oppose the idea that we live because the state grants us these checks, or it gives us these it's going to support us somehow, but rather the ability of working people to sustain themselves, even if that requires their self-organization. Right. To me, it's a background to the 2024 election. It's the question that seems never to be quite crystallized politically, right? That the debates around even the First and Second Amendment seem to me to hearken towards, right? Or to in some ways evoke, but it never gets addressed directly. Right, that the state could determine that your job is not essential, or that this task, that we can close your business, or that you just be happy, stay home and cash your check. Right, and in that sense, the protests that emerged in 2020 in Michigan of people demanding the right to work. Right. Like, to me, that is like even more than like the January 6th protesters. Right. That was like the people with the pitchforks coming for the elites, and that struck the fear of God into the Democrats, and they started saying that Gretchen Whitmer is, being threatened by the militias. They cooked up that whole scam. Right. That is so kind of, it's like a subterranean force that moves through subsequent elections. Right, that to me is where the left betrays itself most obviously. Right, that they think people demanding the right to work in Michigan is a fascist mob. It shows me that these people have lost all connection to socialist traditions in the relationship of liberalism to socialism.
I was just going to answer your question about the 19th century and about the crisis of the Constitution. And, I think one way that you can kind of look at this is through the crisis of the First Amendment of freedom to speech. The kind of what's raised actually in this election is the Alien and Sedition Acts from 1917 that were used to put Eugene Debs, among others, into prison for their criticisms of World War I. This old law has been trotted out against Trump because of his statements on the day of the certification. of the election. And the Alien and Sedition Act itself from 1917 was a kind of throwback to, or it's even named after explicitly, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1790s. James, know about it, 98? Is it 98? It's 98, of 1798. Which, were a kind of early constitutional crisis in American history that had to do with dissent against the support of the U.S. government under John Adams for the British against the French, and which were reversed by Thomas Jefferson in his Revolution of 1800. I'm not, kind of an expert on that history, but the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, the right to freedom of speech, is, kind of imbricated and in capitalism, it comes to be seen as dangerous, basically. I think that's one way of putting it. The speech that people have in the street might cause problems. So like, for instance, after the Civil War, they introduced for the first time, laws against, passing out kind of lascivious magazines and things like this. It's because the Industrial Revolution has given rise to color lithography. So you can have a really nice colored pornography industrially made and sent to people through the mail. There is a kind of uproar about this. And it also gets directed at socialist magazines, namely Victoria Woodhull's magazine, which publishes articles about sexual freedom that then are using these laws, which are meant to stop the distribution through the mail of pornography, censored by the state. The idea being that the free speech of society unregulated by the state is going to undermine our social mores and our social values. This reaches a sort of fever pitch with World War I, because the self-organization of socialists is seen as directly undermining the war effort. And so the argument is that, we kind of can't uphold the absolute freedom of speech because it will undermine our freedom, right, by causing us to lose the war. And then we'll lose our freedoms to Germany or, whatever. So I would say that there is a constitutional crisis in the 19th century. It's not just a 20th century thing. And really the biggest thing to look at would be the Civil War. Because of course the imperial presidency of Lincoln is seen as a direct violation of the Constitution. And in fact, in order to prosecute the Civil War and enforce the end of slavery, right, to expropriate the property of the slaveholders in the South that had rebelled against the Union, Lincoln had to amend the Constitution. It was impossible to accomplish that without new constitutional amendments, which would authorize what seemed to be a blatant violation of not only the rights of states, but the rights of individuals. So it is, it's kind of there in the 19th century. I would say it's not really new with FDR. The difference is that the left and socialism supports FDR in his project. There's a sort of support for the progressive overcoming of the Constitution, which Wilson calls like a dead letter by the left in the 20th century, which is different from the relationship that socialists and Marxists would have had to the crisis of the American Constitution in the 19th.
I'll just add one thing briefly to the earlier point about the American Revolution being born in a project of extraterritorial cosmopolitan radical Whigs. And this goes back to something Spencer said about the hope that the British Empire would be that. I know that because of the insanity of the mainstream media's discussion of Russia, Ukraine, these kinds of things, that a lot of people in Platypus, I talked to people much younger than me in Chicago, are reading and much admiring John Mearsheimer, who's a sort of interesting dissident on these questions. But his view of, he says very interesting things, but his view of the world is extremely reactionary, meaning you can go read his book, Liberal Delusion, about the post-Cold War US foreign policy. Now, there may in fact be a liberal delusion, and we should just live in a world, as he says in that book, of realizing that people, before they can make agreements between each other, are born into tribes, which he says explicitly. he has this really interesting count where he says, people are social before they're political, by which I mean they're in tribal and ethnic groups and relating in those ways before other people, and therefore he says nationalism will always be with us, and therefore there will always be a system of separate nationality and political states. And he says the problem with US foreign policy post-Cold War is it entered a delusion that it could be anything other than that. That's the liberal delusion that has driven post-war US foreign policy, the imagination that you can recreate the world as a single liberal civilization. I'm not saying he's wrong about that. I'm saying he's wrong to date that to 1991. I mean, what's implicit what Erin and Spencer both said is there in 1776, right? His objection is to the American Revolution. That's his real objection, not post-Cold War US foreign policy. Because that desire that the US state be an instrumentality of creating one world liberal civilization is absolutely there from the beginning.
Yeah, so interesting that we're talking about Horkheimer, right? I want to ask a question about Hobbes, who I think is very central here. Hobbes brings a kind of power into being initially an alienated form in his theory. So the modern state comes into being first in alienated form and is then appropriated by society at the point at which the modern state has allowed society to develop to the point at which it's able to appropriate that modern state. In a similar kind of way, we've been talking a lot about regression. Regression is very central to Platypus. Regression would seem to debilitate society and produce something that looks more like a fractious multitude, which would require that an order be created initially in alienated form and then appropriated at a later stage once there's a coalescence. But that seems to be something that maybe we have not been willing to swallow or accept to the degree that we might need to. Are we at a point where the postmoderns, they essentialize this and claim it's fundamental to people? You know, Mearsheimer claiming it's fundamental to people is essentializing. But there is something there in that we have reached a point where there is a fractiousness that makes it quite difficult to operate on the basis of a unitary society or to create a state on the basis of a social consensus.
I mean, I think that the question of regression is complex within, it's certainly complex within Platypus as a 21st century project that was, of course, authorized, as we understand it, by Marxism. And Marxism has a complex sense of that too. Right, which is that Marxism understands the disintegration of society under conditions of capital as an opportunity, right, as the deepest revolutionary potential of this society, right? The deepest revolutionary potential of this society is it's in a sense of tendency towards disintegration. Right, so the crisis character of capitalism, the crisis-ridden character of capitalism, that capitalism is itself a crisis, and that this drives history backwards, is a revolutionary potential for Marxism, right? To consciously re-achieve 1848 and to consciously complete proletarianization. That's the disintegration of the working class, right? That and thereby the achievement of a new form of society beyond bourgeois right. The question of regression now is that it seems to change character when it's no longer a problem being grappled with by society. Right, the socialist workers movement, in other words, at its height, in and through its Marxist political leadership, understood that the attempt to constitute the bourgeoisification of the working class, to re-achieve Adam Smith's society, to re-achieve a society of wage labor, where everyone had a job and everyone was well compensated, and the working class was able to assert its dignity in relation to the employer class. That's self-undermining. The loss of that consciousness is what characterizes regression in the 20th century. Right, so it's a regressive regression in that sense, rather than a potential late regression. That can be, and that has to do with this the utter abdication of the project of self-mastery. Right, that's really what Marxism is about the mastery and completion of the disintegration of capitalism. Right, the disintegration of this form of society under conditions of capital. Right, it's not the achievement of a worker society, it's achievement of a society beyond the commodity form of labor entirely. Right, the disintegration of those social relations. Now we really can't imagine reconstituting. You're in a sense implying a project of a return to kind of 17th century moment. Right, but what I would say is that in as much as we start, in as much as say liberalism is reasserted, immediately it will enter into self-contradiction with itself, even if there's no political project built around that. Right, the hope I think in this moment is, and the real failure of the last 15 odd years is to create a movement that can begin to register the crisis of liberalism, the crisis of trying to reconstitute the subgroup of society, which is not, of course, ever going to happen. But it's going to create a political crisis. The attempt to do that might hopefully create a political crisis. So that would be my first specification in response to you.
Just quickly on Hobbes, because I think, Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism makes the argument that because of the triumph of Stalinism and fascism, which is her way, I think, of talking about also what from the socialists might call the failure of socialism. It seems as though Rousseau has been dethroned and Hobbes is correct, right? That we can't have freedom which is based upon itself, but there needs to be a basis for that freedom. And the basis for that freedom might be nationalism, all these sorts of right-wing things we're talking about, that you're a tribal people, that you're, people first and then a political subject second. And, this is where she kind of has a resonance with the postmodernists. The assumption of the postmodernists and the assumption of Arendt in that statement is that World War I and the failure of socialism and Marxism is a necessary advance upon the problem of capitalism as it presented itself in the 19th century, right? That what we have done through that failure and through that war is overcome forms of politics that were ultimately dead ends. And that World War I, in fact, had to happen. It was necessary. And so it kind of accepts the way in which World War I and the liquidation of Marxism condition the present. Another really good symptom of this, which I think is kind of what you're raising, is James Burnham. So James Burnham in the Managerial Revolution and also in the Machiavellians is also attempting to return to a sort of 17th century, even like 16th century moment. He thinks, there is the need to constitute a state, right, of reason. And that this is going to happen through the growth of the bureaucratic state. This is from the perspective of Marxism, perhaps a sort of positive theory of Bonapartism, right? Bonapartism is like a positive form of life, which is necessary and needs to be advanced. Marxism, in seeking to be conscious of history, seeks to master our relationship to history, which would mean opening up possibilities and potentials in history that were not taken, reading history against the grain. So the hypothesis in question really is was World War I necessary, or was it perhaps unnecessary? And might it be the case that at the end, down the road of perfecting the apparatus, the means of the state, we will once again be posed the question of its rational ends, and that its rational ends are the social subject, the constitution of the social subject and the social revolution, that will again be posed the social question of the 19th century. That is basically a kind of underground theoretical question that has no reality of politics today, and is asked by somebody like Theodore Adorno as his students walk out of the room to go have a protest. So that is the state of this question, but that I think it maybe answers your question a bit, I hope.
Just add one point quickly, to what both Spencer and Erin said about the proletarian socialist project to reconstitute a rational social subject. That is the only context in which really, let me rephrase that. That is the fundamental context in which I think the revisiting of the constitutional order of the fundamental law of society and the degree to which it is a political deadlock that doesn't allow for the future transformability of society's transformability of itself. That is where the constitutional order should be confronted, or where the constitutional order be confronted and potentially overcome. The point I was trying to make earlier, tie back something said at the end of my talk, perhaps too crudely, is what the progressive project is to do is precisely not to seek a social transformation, a constitution of a rational social subject, but rather to seek to suspend the fundamental law of society, to suspend the constitutional order, not to overcome it, but to suspend it to allow the state, the administrative state, to operate free from it in the management of the crisis and degradation of society that is going on under capitalism. That's the aim of the progressives, right? To both preserve capitalism and in doing so to destroy civil liberty.
Yeah. Well, the last comment, James, is sort of making me rethink my question, but I'll just pose my question as it's been sitting with me. So, so I found all the talks quite illuminating, but I'm a bit uneasy about the characterization of current critiques of the Constitution, so which I'm much more familiar with than I am familiar with that era. But I see on the one hand the critique. I think Erin mentioned this phrase from a Gerald Horne book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which I had to look up. And that seems to go along with the 1619 Project's critique of the founders, the framers, as sort of representing primarily the interests of the white slavers, right? So, so that's one critique of the Constitution, which I think is less interesting than another one, which I think is also current, which Daniel Lazar, who was mentioned, I think is one of the main people there, and I think he has a critique of the Constitution as maybe part of a counter-revolution of 1787, where the potential revolutionary spirit of 76 was sort of counteracted by large parts of the Constitution and its elements like the Senate. I think that's his main target in the present constitutional order, right? So I guess I wanted to understand if the panelists were clear on these two different critiques, and if they have any thoughts on that, because
I didn't hear that. If we're clear on the difference.
Yeah, the difference between these two critiques as I've posed them. So the sort of race-oriented critique, I guess you could say, but I think it's broader. It's maybe the standard leftist critique of the Constitution, which is that it was,
The slaveholders revolution.
yeah, right. So I'm not sure who the main representatives of that are, other than perhaps Gerald Horn, but, and then I'm kind of posing this critique, that Lazar, among others, have put forth, of a more critique. Perhaps I could put it this way, that, they're calling not for a suspension of the Constitution in the spirit that, you know, as was mentioned, a large part of the progressive left in the US has put their faith more in administrators, right, than in the Constitution. But I think others are calling for sort of a new Constitution in a more Jeffersonian spirit that, you know, every generation, or perhaps less frequent, but Jefferson spoke of every generation needing to put into place a new Constitution, right?
The
So,
argument too is to get rid of the Senate and also the Electoral College.
yeah, you hear about the Electoral College a lot, but Lazar
The
focuses on.
Lazar talks about the Senate.
I mean, it certainly relates to James's point about amending the Constitution and why there's such a high bar. But really, I think it gets to the issue of the evisceration of the concept of society's self-government, right? And how liberalism understood that, right? And how it conflates it with democracy, right? The issue, in other words, is that it's that the extension of the suffrage as an attempt, like the question of representation in the 18th and 19th centuries is it's present. So there's a big movement for the extension of suffrage in 1776 in Britain. Famous pamphlet called Take Your Choice, for instance, by Major Cartwright. Growing out of the wider kind of Wilkesite movement that James has written about, in the broader kind of crisis of the revolution in 1760s and 70s. So the issue of suffrage is not insignificant. Society has to be represented, and sometimes that might take a democratizing form, just by the simple extension of the suffrage. But what, and James can add to this, what he's raising is the possibility of consensus. Right, the issue of general will, you know, and the amendment to the Constitution is an imagination of consensus that would be arrived at through reasoned discussion, information, deriving full information on questions, the deliberate solicitation of the opinions of many, you know, the sussing out of those opinions, the debating, the turning of questions in the light of reason by an assembled body of people, or the role of reason itself being given scope. Right? We can't imagine anything, we can't imagine anything like that ever happening. Right? We can't imagine the kind of votes by yeas and nays that they used to take in the 18th century. Right? Where they wouldn't even count the vote. Right? They would just say, all in favor, say aye. And everyone would say aye. Or maybe there'd be a nay or two, you know, and the speaker would move on. Why? Because the debate had been compelling. Right? This is how we should deal with the Oregon Territory, or whatever. Right? And so I think that people therefore resist hate. They hate the Constitution because it doesn't think that society is expressed through any one organ of the state. This is really what I think James is getting at. Like, that there's a law prior to lawmaking. There's a law prior to adjudicating the law in a system, in a court system. Right, which is why we want society to flow through the courts in the form of juries and the judgment of the local jurisdiction. There is society flowing through the executive. Right, the executive has prerogatives beyond any legal mandate. Right, the executive has the right to defend the territory before a declaration of war. If the legislature is not in session, you can't wait. Right, the executive executes, operates on the basis of its prerogatives to save society, to defend it, etc. These are things that I think now, the underlying kind of philosophical understanding of that, is lost in favor of, the Senate is undemocratic, or the Electoral College is undemocratic. Yeah, but it's liberal. It defends the rights. Is it undemocratic that the people of Montana, elect a senator on the basis of whatever 400,000 people, and the people of California do it on the basis of tens of millions? Yes. Is it liberal? Yes. Because there's different interests in Idaho or in Montana than there are in California. Right? There's 50 different countries here. Right? Their sovereignty is not a joke, right? It's real. Those protections are real. Those protections were introduced, of course, in the service of freedom, right? To defend us against the tyranny of Virginia with its slavery and its population, right? There should be representation to Connecticut and Rhode Island, right? These historians just, they first of all, they obscure the actual facts of the case. Right, the actual debates, and they act like these things were in the service of defending slavery, and they were manifestly not. And more importantly, there is a total crisis in the self-understanding of our republic as rooted in, essentially Montesquieuian liberalism. The kind of thing that you hear, Chris trying to explain to Doug Lane over and over and over again, right, in those podcasts.
Go, Daniel, if I grasp your question, right? For me, it's when people start, I know, like, forget about the possibility of a renewed socialist proletarian practice. Just in the world we're at now with resources today. When people want to talk about reforming or changing the Constitution, I have no issue with that, right? That's not the issue. The issue I have is when people set out and say, there can't be any kind of socialist or emancipatory politics because all these prior existing constitutional obstacles exist that prevent that from taking place. In other words, you can just Jacobin magazine article after Jacobin magazine articles, all these reasons why we can't possibly have socialist politics because the Constitution. All of that, really, whatever the intention of the authors, what that becomes is the ideological apparatus of the administrative state. Meaning it becomes the ability, we can't really do anything emancipatory because the Constitution stops it, right? And we can't really change the Constitution because, as Spencer said, people cannot imagine a world anymore of the public exercise of reason. We might collectively debate and deliberate over this and changing this. And in the context of renewed socialist practice, I could imagine a renewed socialist practice in the United States doing exactly what Jean-Luc Mélenchon wants in France, which is a new constitutional assembly to talk about a sixth republic. I could completely see that potentiality arising in that context. But people who write these articles saying we can't have socialist politics because the Constitution has all these unlimited obstacles because it's the product of slaveholders It's the product of, it's frozen in amber in a late 18th century world of family farmers, whatever their version of it is. What it's about is sort of saying, we can't have socialist practice because the Constitution prevents it somehow. I don't know how that's the case, by the way. Certainly, the most successful socialist practice in this country, Eugene Debs's Socialist Party, never thought that, right, for any reason. That you couldn't socially organize in civil society and develop a socialist practice that may eventually raise these questions of let's have another convention, which, by the way, the founders, the writers of the Constitution think is likely to happen. That there will be future conventions and assemblies of the whole people, even under completely changed circumstances, because they're aware that commercial society constantly change. And that new people will be here, new people, social interest, economic groups will be involved in that process of elaborating all of that. But when people write these articles saying the Constitution stops us from having socialist practice, and by the way, we can't even in the normal course of politics change the Constitution because it's insuperable. There's no point trying to persuade our fellow citizens, right, that we need these changes. To me, whatever their intent of saying all that, it's just the ideological apparatus of the administrative state, right? It's just saying, therefore, we can suspend its operations because society has become complex. And, our modern complex society, that is just, and this allows people with greater expertise and experience to essentially suspend its operation and to do all these things. And to do so often, and what they will articulate to do this is, of course, is endless categories of so-called discriminated against minorities. And articulating those categories is really about creating greater state power suspended from constitutional limits.
I just had a question for you, James, actually, about this question, because you talked about in your presentation the idea that there's some sort of like 1780s thermidor. And I wonder how much this is related to people's criticisms of the Constitution. I mean, what I often find, and this, Dan Lazar was on a panel at NYU about the Constitution, so I kind of heard him give his criticism. I can kind of reverse it, which is that, he thinks, he kind of wants to take sides in the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate and say, like, the Bill of Rights is good and it was kind of a halfway measure, but other aspects of the Constitution, and especially the articles of the Constitution, right, are bad. And the articles that establish the Senate and, the way that we establish the relationship of the states to the federal government was like a compromise with a truly revolutionary position. So I was just wondering if maybe you could talk a bit about, or, what is like the American Constitution? Like, how is it that the American Constitution is carrying forward the question of the American Revolution and constituting the free society? And, how do we make sense of the fact that today different aspects of the Constitution seem to be arrayed against one another, or at least they've been presented that way by the left? I think any young student really gets this sort of education that, there's a 3/5 compromise, and certain aspects of the Constitution are preferred by the slaveholding South and they're bad, and other aspects are preferred by other people and they're better.
Just very quickly, I mean, the thing that I was quoting Bernard Bailyn, because he was trying to speak to students in the 1970s, the progressive narrative about the Constitution that begins to be articulated in the 19th and early 20th century and really culminates in things like speeches by Woodrow Wilson and books by Charles Beard and Carl Becker and Mary Louise Beard, is essentially that there was this incredibly democratizing moment of the 60s and 70s. They were huge fans of the kind of democratic majoritarian unicameral legislatures that get put in place that seem to suggest, adult male suffrage will be universalized and they will elect representatives, and those representatives will just be able, 50% plus one, make whatever laws they want. And they see the later move in the 1780s towards not having these highly democratic unicameral legislators, but rather a system of checks and balances, setting an independent executive and an independent judiciary in productive tension with the legislature. They see these as essentially counter-revolutionary moves. They're not. I mean, the founding, you don't need Tocqueville to get the concept of tyranny of the majority. It's absolutely already articulated, and the chief people become the architects of the federal constitution, i.e. that the rights of society need to be defended as much against an arbitrary mob as they do against an arbitrary king or an arbitrary parliament. That a majority can be arbitrary against a minority as much as a tiny landed elite can be arbitrary against a whole population. And so that's already articulated there. And this just takes many, many different, this progressive critique gets more and more elaborated. And Balin was trying to speak to New Left students who, and of course there was an alternative socialist understanding at the time the progressive critique is being articulated. But by the time of the New Left, that Democratic Party progressive Woodrow Wilson Franklin Roosevelt interpretation is the dominant interpretation on the left. And what they add to it is simply, yes, and it wasn't just a democratizing moment that could have included adult white male workers, but also it failed to include enslaved. There could have been some inclusion of enslaved men and women, people of African descent, women, it's all together, etc. And so the New Left social movements are finding all of these groups that are excluded and adding to that, right? And very much unintentionally, they're going to reinforce a certain civil rights regime, which becomes not about protecting against the tyranny of the majority, but becomes about empowering the state to be ever more powerful over society because of endless discriminating against minorities. And which was already the point I'm trying to make in the constitutional order was the fear of the discriminated against minorities. That was already motivating the project. That basically is then finally where the 1619 project comes in. And Danny has talked about this, Gerald Horne, Counter-Revolution of 1776, published in 2013. I think it's the only thing footnoted when, I'm forgetting her, Nicole Hannah-Jones writes the original version that they pretend they didn't write, but then thankfully the International Socialist
World Socialist.
they had screen captured all of the original. In case you didn't have an original, they tried, the 1690 Project guys pretend they didn't say things they said in the original Sunday New York Times Magazine in August 2019, because they scrubbed, which the New York Times had never done before, their digital edition without saying they scrubbed it. They used to scrub it, they included an editorial comment saying we scrubbed it, this with the original remarks. That's ethical editorial practice. You can always make changes, there are errors, there are new understandings, but you recognize the original understanding and how it's been replaced. And they simply hoped everybody digitally consumed it, would scrub it completely. But anyway, I'm sorry to go off on this tangent. But the 1690 Project just adds to this narrative. It's the counter-revolution is all the way from the beginning, because it's a slaveholders revolt from the very beginning. And so essentially it's a slaveholders revolt because the British Empire is somehow mystically moving against slavery in the 1760s, which is unclear to me how that's taking place. And therefore, you essentially have the origins of the American Revolution because the colonists want to maintain their slaves against the British Empire. And so they launch a revolution to preserve slavery. And the only evidence anyone ever deduces of this is the fact that certain British governors, like Lord Dunmore, are offering freedom to slaves who join British forces and trying to put down the colonial American resistance movement and revolution. But that's all happening in 74, 75, when the revolution's getting off the ground. It's not been motivating of the revolution at all. Anyway, sorry, there begins to be complaints about enslaved people being offered freedom to precisely crush this freedom project that's going on. And then this is adduced as these are the real causes of the revolution the whole time. The point of all this to say, then, of course, then the Constitution just becomes the fulfillment of the counter-revolution. So the older progressive narrative is there was a genuine revolution that had a thermidor, a counter-revolution that basically put the brakes on it. It was a kind of conservative phase against the more radical phrase, whereas the latest version is it's counter-revolutionary from the beginning. Right, it's counter-revolutionary from the beginning, and in that sense, the Constitution is just the fulfillment of a slaveholders' revolt. Anyway, we're past time. I'll stop. It just begs the question of why then do the slaveholders have to revolt against it in the 1860s, if it is just from beginning to end a slaveholders document?
just want to tag one last thing on it, which is the confusion around the Constitution, it's commonly that what's being debated is the Bill of Rights. Right? But the core of the original articles is rarely discussed, right? And there's a deepening and a rendering it much more profound, largely to the influence of Montesquieu, who himself is a commentator on the English Constitution of a understanding of the British Revolution. Right? If we think about the British Revolution, it's parliamentary supremacy over the crown. It's a limitation of the power of the crown. Right? But the way that the British revolutionaries understood that was that the king in parliament is the most powerful monarch in the world. Right? It's by virtue of it being seated in the representatives of society that the executive has its greatest force. It's the limitation of the power of the king that the king becomes most powerful. Right? That's expanded within the understanding of the very self-consciously in the Federalist Papers, in the self-understanding of the Constitution, that the limitation, the so-called checks and balances of the different branches of government are actually strengthening the capacity of society to operate through the state. Right? And this is completely, well, thank God that, the president can't do that, or the justices can't do this, right? We have a completely negative conception of it as a limitation of the concept of checks and balances, rather than as the realization of what James was talking about, right? Of the capacity of society to give the law to itself so that it's operating through its own state as a form of self-regulation, self-sovereignty, ultimately, right? That Rousseauian core of the impulse of the American Revolution is being given this, very legalistic Montesquieuian constitutional architecture in the main body of the Constitution articles, and it's because of the failure to understand this liberal conception of the relationship of state and society that in a total progressivism, the vanguard of which is the left, liquidating the understanding of liberalism, that this is not even discussed, much less understood anymore.
This would be, just to underscore exactly what Spencer said, I'm going to forget if this is Benjamin Franklin or John Adams, but the last civilian royal governor of this state that we're in, Massachusetts, Commonwealth, Massachusetts, previously the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The last royally appointed civilian governor is Thomas Hutchinson. And Thomas Hutchinson basically says about the colonial American resistance movement, if they have their way, there will be no government. It's an anarchy. It'll be impossible to govern. I can't remember for the life of me, it's Franklin or Adams who responds, no, in seeking to limit the government's ability to do evil, we seek to give it an unlimited ability to do good, right? That it's not simply about negativity, limiting, but also being able to allow government to bring the full resources and capacities of a free society to bear in doing the things that it's supposed to do, or doing the things that it's allowed to do.
Just next to that, a quote from Leonard, that what we want is the administration of things and not the administration of people, which is precisely that desire.
And with that, let's thank our panelists. All right, so we have a 2-hour lunch break. Part of the reason it's 2 hours is because there's not a lot of food right around here.